She was 22 and alone. No room, no tuition, no family, just a cedar box of pressed flowers tied with blue thread and one wrinkled dollar she had kept folded inside her grandmother's birthday card. And with that dollar, she bought a forgotten pressed flower studio on the edge of Port Townsend, Jefferson County, Washington, a place the county said had fallen off the public maps in 1987. The north roof glass leaked in 3 places. The back sill had gone soft from winter rain. The county said the building had been closed since 1987 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the central wing of a botanical drying press, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 60 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Sylvie Anne Whitaker had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. She had learned early how to pack a room before anyone said the room was no longer hers. She could fold 2 sweaters into the width of one, slide photographs between the pages of a borrowed book, and carry breakable things against her ribs without letting them knock together. By the time she was 9, she knew the sound of adults speaking in the kitchen with their voices lowered, the clipped, careful way they made decisions about rent, gas, groceries, and which bill could survive another week in the drawer. She grew up in a narrow apartment over a closed bakery in Bremerton, where the air always carried a faint sweetness from the ovens that had gone cold years before. The front windows faced a parking lot striped with rainwater, and the back stairwell smelled of damp cardboard and old mop water. Her bed stood beside the radiator, and in winter she slept with one hand against the metal ribs, learning from the pulse of heat whether the landlord had remembered the furnace. There were few beautiful things in that apartment, but Sylvie remembered them exactly. A chipped green mixing bowl, a brass lamp with a crooked shade, a curtain printed with faded violets. On Sunday mornings, when light came through that curtain, it made the whole room look as if it had been washed in tea. Her mother, Lila, worked the front desk at a dental office and came home with her hair pinned so tight it left a ridge above her ears. She was not unkind in any simple way. She put cough syrup on the spoon. She signed school forms. She once walked 3 miles in February rain to bring Sylvie a clean dress after a classmate spilled chocolate milk down the front of hers. But Lila had the tiredness of a woman who had spent too many years apologizing to people with better shoes. When she sat at the kitchen table, she did not sit down all at once. She lowered herself carefully, as if the chair might ask something more of her. Her love came folded inside errands, inside washed socks and quiet plates of dinner set down without comment. It did not know how to stand between a child and the world. Sylvie's father existed mostly in paperwork. His name appeared on a birth certificate, a school emergency card, and once on a yellow envelope of back child support that arrived already opened. She had no memory of his voice. Her mother kept one photograph of him in a shoebox with old tax returns, and when Sylvie found it at 12, the man looking back seemed less like a parent than a stranger waiting for a ferry. The person who stayed was her grandmother. Eleanor Whitaker lived 3 bus rides away in Port Angeles, in a cottage with moss on the shingles and salal pressing close to the porch steps. She was Lila's mother, though the 2 of them carried their resemblance like a burden neither wished to name. Eleanor had worked for years as a clerk in a small marine supply office, but the thing she knew with patient exactness was plants. Not flowers in vases, not florist flowers wrapped in plastic, but the honest bodies of plants. Their stems, their veins, their undersides, their briefness. She called herself an amateur botanist, saying the word amateur with old pride, as if it meant a person who loved something enough to serve it without applause. Every second Saturday, Sylvie took the early bus to her grandmother's cottage with a canvas bag against her knees. Eleanor would be waiting at the stop in a wool coat the colour of wet stone, her silver hair wound into a bun, her hands bare even in cold weather. They walked home slowly, because Eleanor stopped for plants the way other people stopped for news. She taught Sylvie the names of things growing in cracks and ditches: yarrow, Nootka rose, pearly everlasting, sword fern, red flowering currant, ocean spray with its cream-coloured plumes. She taught her to cut nothing carelessly, to take only what the plant could spare, and to thank the place by leaving it looking uninjured. Back at the cottage, the kitchen table became their workbench. Eleanor laid down 3 layers of blotting paper, then a sheet of plain newsprint. Then the days gathered stems. She showed Sylvie how to separate petals with a hatpin, how to open a fern without tearing the pinnae, how to turn the face of a flower so its future shape would still speak after colour had faded. The press itself was modest, 2 maple boards with straps at the corners and wing nuts worn smooth by use. Eleanor tightened each corner a little at a time, never rushing the pressure. Then, every other day for the next 2 weeks, she changed the papers. Damp ones came out cool and fragrant. Dry ones went in clean. She marked each specimen in pencil with the date, location, weather, and a note about the soil. "Memory is not what we keep," Eleanor said once, pressing a sprig of wild bleeding heart beneath the paper. "It is what we keep carefully." Sylvie was 13 then, old enough to hear that the sentence meant more than flowers. It meant a life could be poor and still exact. It meant loss did not excuse carelessness. It meant the world was always vanishing, but some hands were allowed to slow the vanishing for a little while. By high school, Sylvie had a box under her bed filled with her own pressed plants. She wrote Latin names badly at first, then better. She learned that Japan paper could hold a fragile stem without smothering it, that methyl cellulose mixed too thick left a shine, and that cheap glass browned whatever it was supposed to protect. Eleanor sent her home with small envelopes of dried lavender and old field guides from library sales. On Sylvie's 17th birthday, she gave her a cedar box with brass hinges and a blue thread tied around the clasp. Inside were 12 pressed flowers from every year Sylvie had been coming to the cottage. There was one for the first day they met at the bus stop, one for the year Sylvie cried over algebra into a bowl of soup, one from the spring after Lila remarried, when Sylvie had arrived with a bruise-coloured silence around her, and Eleanor had not asked questions until the kettle boiled. Each specimen was labelled in Eleanor's narrow hand. After graduation, Sylvie received a partial scholarship to a college in Seattle with a strong environmental studies program. The rest came from grants, campus work, and the kind of loans that looked clean on paper until they entered a young person's sleep. Eleanor cried at the bus station, though she did it neatly, with a handkerchief pressed beneath her glasses. "Learn the official names," she told Sylvie, "then come home and remember the common ones." For 3 semesters, Sylvie studied plant ecology, archival methods, and restoration biology. She worked nights reshelving books in the library basement and mornings washing glassware in a lab that smelled of ethanol and wet soil. She ate oatmeal from paper cups and called her grandmother every Sunday evening from a stairwell where the reception held steady if she did not move. Then in October, Eleanor fell in her garden. The neighbour found her beside the path where she had been cutting seed heads from the last of the autumn asters. She died 2 days later in a hospital room with a view of a brick wall and one narrow slice of sky. Sylvie arrived in time to hold her hand, but not in time for the last words. Eleanor's fingers were cold except at the base of the thumb, where some small warmth remained, stubborn and human. After the funeral, the cottage changed hands with the speed of paperwork. There had been taxes owed, medical bills, and a lien Sylvie had never heard mentioned. Lila said there was nothing to be done. Her new husband, Warren Pike, said this while standing in Eleanor's kitchen with his coat still on, as if the room were contagious. Warren was not a loud man. That made him worse in memory. He had the manner of a person who closed doors softly, so no one could accuse him of slamming them. He worked as an assistant manager at an appliance store and kept his receipts in labelled envelopes. His hair was always damp from a comb. His shoes had square toes, polished to a hard shine. He did not hit, he did not shout, he reduced. He reduced meals to cost. He reduced grief to inconvenience. He reduced Eleanor's cottage to assessed value, Sylvie's education to unpaid balance, and every object in the rooms to either resale or disposal. He moved through the cottage with a clipboard, placing coloured stickers on furniture and boxes. Yellow meant keep, blue meant donate, red meant trash. Sylvie watched him put a red sticker on a crate of cracked flower presses, old blotting paper, and hand-labelled specimen folders damaged by roof damp. She knelt to lift the folders out, but the mildew had travelled through them in grey blooms. Pages stuck together, stems broke into dust. 40 years of patient collection had been thinned in a single wet winter and finished by strangers wearing work gloves. She saved what she could: a loop, 3 field notebooks, the cedar birthday box, a pair of small scissors with Eleanor's initials scratched into the handle. The rest went into black contractor bags that sagged at the porch rail in the rain. 2 weeks after the funeral, the college financial office sent its notice. Sylvie had applied for emergency tuition relief under bereavement hardship. She wrote the application 3 times before submitting it, deleting every sentence that sounded like begging. She attached the death certificate, the funeral receipt, her work-study schedule, and a letter from her ecology professor saying she was one of the most careful students he had taught. The reply came on a Thursday afternoon. The committee regretted that it could not extend additional institutional aid. Full payment was required within 5 business days. Failure to pay would result in course removal, housing termination, and loss of campus employment eligibility. The language had no weather in it, no body, no room for a girl sitting on a dormitory bed with her grandmother's scissors in her palm. 5 business days later, her student card stopped opening the dining hall. On the 6th, the housing office taped a notice to her door. On the 7th, her work-study supervisor looked at the floor while explaining that federal rules were federal rules and that he wished her well. She left the dormitory with 2 bags, the cedar box, and a pillowcase filled with books she later abandoned one by one. At Lila and Warren's apartment in Tacoma, the hallway smelled of canned soup and carpet cleaner. Sylvie stood outside the door with rain ticking from her hair onto the collar of her coat. She had called once from the bus station, and Lila had said Warren was home, which meant more than the words themselves. Inside, Warren had cleared a space by the door, not in a bedroom or at the kitchen table, but on the narrow strip of linoleum where deliveries were set down. A cardboard box waited there. In it were the few things Sylvie had left from childhood: a cracked mug with a painted rabbit, a school art project wrapped in newspaper, and a framed photograph of Eleanor standing beside a rhododendron taller than herself. Warren held the frame by its corner. "You cannot keep what you cannot pay for." 8 words. He said them evenly, without heat, as though he were reading a store policy printed beside a register. Sylvie looked past him at her mother. Lila stood near the sink with a dish towel twisted between both hands. Her face had gone still in the way faces go still when they have already chosen not to move. She did not tell Warren to stop. She did not open a closet. She did not say there was room for one night on the couch. The betrayal was not a door slammed in Sylvie's face. It was her mother's silence making room for Warren's hand on the knob. Sylvie took the cardboard box because leaving Eleanor's photograph there felt like a second burial. She did not argue. Some refusals are so complete that speech only makes them colder. She carried the box down 3 flights, set it on the curb beneath the apartment awning, and repacked what she could beneath the streetlight. The rabbit mug went into a donation bin before dawn. The art project softened in the rain and was left beside a public trash can. The photograph she kept. For 6 weeks, Sylvie moved through western Washington like a thing misplaced. She slept first in Tacoma, on a bench inside the transit center, until a security guard tapped the sole of her shoe with 2 fingers and told her she had to sit upright. She learned which restrooms were locked after midnight and which coffee shops would let a person hold a paper cup for 2 hours if she kept her coat buttoned and did not close her eyes. She had $47.60 the night she left the apartment building. By the end of the first week, she had $31 after bus fare and 2 meals bought hot because her hands would not stop shaking. In Olympia, she slept behind the state library under an overhang where the wind drove rain sideways but did not reach the wall. A woman in a red knit hat gave her a banana without speaking. Sylvie ate it slowly, sitting on her backpack, the peel folded into a square afterward because Eleanor had taught her not to leave a place uglier than she found it. In Aberdeen, she spent 3 nights in a church basement shelter that smelled of bleach, wool coats and coffee left too long on a burner. The cots were close together. Men coughed in their sleep. A volunteer named Mr. Alvarez noticed the cedar box under Sylvie's arm and gave her 2 rubber bands from the church office so the latch would not spring open. He did not ask what was inside. By the third week she had $20.09. She stopped buying coffee. She bought day-old rolls from grocery racks and packets of peanut butter from gas stations when the clerks were kind enough to pretend not to count them. In Shelton, she slept in a laundry room behind a marina after finding the door wedged with a broken clothespin. The dryers were silent, but one held a little leftover warmth, and she sat with her back against it until morning came grey through the high window. She washed in sinks when she could. She dried her socks beneath hand dryers. She cut the campus logo from her sweatshirt because strangers kept asking whether she was headed home for break. In Bremerton, she nearly returned to the old bakery apartment, though she knew another family lived there now. She stood across the street at dusk and watched a child press both hands against the upstairs window where her bed had once been. Behind the glass, a lamp glowed with a straight shade, not the crooked brass one, and the curtain was blue. She did not cross the street. By the fifth week, she had $7.18. Her world had narrowed to libraries, bus schedules, public bathrooms, and the old arithmetic of hunger. She read bulletin boards for free meals, day labor, lost pets, grief groups, and rooms for rent that required deposits larger than kingdoms. She walked when buses cost too much. She learned that a backpack grows heavier each day even when nothing new is placed inside it. The cedar box became the one object she never set down unless her body touched it. In ferry terminals it rested beneath her knees. In shelters it went inside her coat. When she slept in a hay barn outside Chimacum after walking too far in hard rain, she tucked it beneath her sweater and woke with bits of straw caught in her hair and the smell of animals in the dark around her. On the last Monday before Thanksgiving, Sylvie entered the Port Townsend Public Library because rain had turned sharp and the building's windows held a yellow patience she could not resist. She had $1.83 then. Her shoes were damp through the soles. Her coat cuffs had frayed into threads. The library stood warm and orderly with old wood shelves and a view of water beyond the windows. She sat at a public computer for 20 minutes, the limit written on a laminated card beside the keyboard. She searched for emergency housing first, then day work, then estate cleanouts, then, without knowing why, abandoned properties Jefferson County. Most listings were legal notices, tax parcels, and warnings written in county language. She clicked through them because the rain continued and because reading was warmer than walking. Near the bottom of a municipal surplus page, she saw an entry with no photograph. Structure only, former pressed flower studio, non-conforming accessory building, Port Townsend outskirts, quitclaim transfer, $1. Buyer assumes all liability, back tax, removal, repair or demolition requirements. Beneath that, in smaller type, the description said the building had been used from 1912 through 1964 as a private botanical pressing and gilded framing studio, later abandoned, then condemned after storm damage, no utilities guaranteed, no occupancy certification. Purchase did not prevent future county action. Sylvie read the listing 3 times. Pressed flower studio. The words sat on the screen with an old, waiting stillness. She clicked the attached notice. There was a legal parcel number, a clerk's office address, and a deadline. Bids accepted in person until 4 o'clock the following day. Minimum bid $1. Cash only. No warranties. No right of rescission. A man at the next computer cleared his throat and shifted in his chair, somewhere near the children's section. A librarian was reading aloud from a picture book about winter birds. Outside, rain moved down the glass in patient lines. Sylvie opened the cedar box on her lap. The blue thread had darkened from years of handling. Inside, the pressed flowers lay in their careful sleeves, each one labelled by Eleanor's hand. She touched the first sleeve with one finger. Nootka Rose, Port Angeles Bluff. Light rain, June 14th. She had $1.83. A bus to the clerk's office cost more than she could spare if she wanted the dollar intact. A room was impossible. Food could wait because hunger had already become a place she knew how to enter and leave. The listing might be nothing more than a collapsing shed with a pretty former use and a county file thick with rot. Still, the words had found the one part of her that had not yet learned to lie down. She wrote the address on the back of an old grocery receipt. Then she asked the reference librarian for directions, speaking carefully because her voice had gone rough from disuse. The librarian, a woman with silver earrings shaped like leaves, studied Sylvie's wet shoes and the cedar box under her arm. She printed the walking route without charging for the page. "It's a long way in this weather," the librarian said. "Yes, ma'am," Sylvie answered. The woman hesitated, then slid a pencil across the desk. "Road names change out there. Mark the turns." Sylvie marked them. Washington Street, Sims Way, a county road, a gravel spur with no bus service. She folded the page into quarters and placed it inside Eleanor's field notebook. That night, she did not sleep in the library because it closed at 8. She walked to the ferry terminal and sat beneath a heater that worked only in short breaths. The cedar box rested against her stomach. Her last 83 cents were in her coat pocket. 2 quarters, 3 dimes, and 3 pennies worn dull. The dollar stayed folded inside the birthday card, flat and guarded, as if it had become less money than permission. Before dawn, she washed her face in the ferry restroom and combed her hair with her fingers until it lay as neatly as it could. She put Eleanor's photograph inside the cedar box beneath the pressed flowers. Then she stepped out into the cold morning with the printed directions in her hand. The town was still dark at the edges. Gulls cried over the water somewhere. A delivery truck backed up with 3 soft beeps, and a man's voice answered from an alley. Sylvie walked toward the county clerk's office carrying everything that had not been taken, sold, ruined, or left behind. By 4 o'clock, she would either have lost the last dollar in her name, or she would own a condemned building the county had already marked for disappearance. She did not yet know that the studio was not empty. Morning came through a low ceiling of cloud, and Sylvie followed the printed directions with the paper folded small enough to fit in her palm. She had learned to travel with her eyes lowered just enough to see broken glass, puddles, and the tilted edges of sidewalks, but not so low that she missed street signs. Port Townsend had a way of rising above her in weathered cornices and tall windows. The old buildings along the water standing with their backs to the hill and their faces toward the bay, paint peeled where salt had worried it, brass handles had gone dull under thousands of hands. Even the gutters seemed to hold a kind of Victorian patience, collecting rain as if that were honest work. The bus she needed did not run all the way to the county spur road listed in the notice, but one driver took pity on the folded sheet in her hand and told her which stop would spare her nearly 3 miles. He was a wide-shouldered man with a grey beard trimmed square beneath his chin, and he kept one gloved hand on the wheel while pointing out the windshield with the other. "Get off after the school fields," he said, "then walk back to the road with the mailbox row. Do not follow the first gravel drive. That one goes to a farm." "Yes, sir," Sylvie said. He watched her in the mirror for a moment, not prying, only measuring the coat, the box, the 2 bags, and the face of a young woman trying to look less cold than she was. "You got far to go. To the clerk's office first." "That is the right order," he said, and closed the door with a breath of air. The bus carried her past wet storefronts, boatyards, a church with dark windows, and houses set back behind hedges bent by wind. At every stop a little of the town entered and left, a woman with a paper sack of groceries, 2 boys in school jackets, an older man smelling faintly of cedar shavings, a nurse in blue shoes who leaned her head against the glass and closed her eyes for 3 stops. Sylvie sat near the back with the cedar box across her knees. The road climbed, then levelled, then climbed again through a loose country of firs, fenced fields, mailboxes and sheds with tin roofs beaded in rain. The temperature sign outside a feed store read 38 to scare a hant. By the time she stepped down from the bus, the damp had entered the seams of her shoes, and the printed map had softened at the creases. She walked the rest under a sky the colour of pewter. The road shoulder was narrow. Passing trucks pushed cold air against her coat. At a ditch crossing, she paused to shift the weight of one bag from her left shoulder to her right, and for a moment the cedar box slipped. She caught it against her hip with both hands. That quick motion, that old fear of losing what could not be replaced, made her stand still longer than she meant to. A brown hay barn stood across the field, its doors chained but not closed, the dark seam between them wide enough for weather to enter. She had slept in a barn not long before when the night dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit and the rain turned thin and metallic against the roof. She remembered the smell of hay dust and animal heat held in the boards, the way her breath had opened in front of her and disappeared. That memory moved beside her now, close as another person, but it did not turn her back. Near the edge of town again, the county buildings appeared with no ceremony. Brick concrete flagpoles, trimmed shrubs darkened by rain. The clerk's office stood in a modest annex with square windows and a ramp slick with fallen maple leaves. A sign beside the door listed hours, recording fees, marriage licenses, property transfers, tax liens and public notices. Sylvie stood beneath the awning and wiped her shoes on the mat longer than necessary. Inside, warm air pressed against her face. The town around the county office had been waking by slow degrees. Before entering, she had passed 5 businesses whose names remained in her mind because they seemed like proof that ordinary life had continued without waiting for her to recover. There was Aldrich's Market with oranges stacked in the window and a chalkboard promising salmon chowder. There was William James' bookseller, still closed, its display arranged with maritime histories and a field guide to Pacific Northwest mushrooms. There was a narrow cafe called the Blue Heron, where a woman in a denim apron lifted chairs down from tables. There was Rose Theatre with old posters sealed behind glass, the gold trim around the ticket window worn at elbow height. Farther up, beside a shop selling handmade candles and soaps, a bicycle leaned against a hitching post as if the 19th century and the present had agreed to share a corner. The clerk's office smelled of toner, damp wool and floor wax. A row of plastic chairs lined one wall. A man in a yellow raincoat was filling out a title form at a counter. Behind glass partitions, 2 clerks moved papers from trays to scanners, each motion practiced enough to look nearly silent. Sylvie took a number from a red dispenser, 42. The display above the counter read 39. She sat with her bags gathered at her feet and the cedar box beneath both hands. Her coat was drying badly, giving off a woolen smell. On the wall opposite her hung framed maps of Jefferson County, some recent and some aged brown at the edges. She studied the lines of roads and water, the inlets and points, the names that seemed less like directions than remnants. Discovery Bay, Marrowstone, Chimacum, Cape George. Port Townsend sat above them all with its old brick dignity, looking larger on paper than it felt underfoot. Number 40 came and went, then 41. When 42 glowed in red, Sylvie stood too quickly and had to steady one of the bags with her knee. The clerk at window 3 looked up. She was a woman in her late 60s with cropped white hair, narrow shoulders and a navy cardigan buttoned to the throat. Her glasses hung from a silver chain. A nameplate on the counter read Marion Voss, County Clerk, in black letters scratched faintly near the edges from years of being moved and wiped. Beside it sat a brass date stamp, a cup of sharpened pencils, and a small ceramic dish filled with paper clips sorted by size. Marion Voss did not smile, but she did not harden either. She looked at Sylvie the way careful people look at damaged envelopes, wondering whether the contents might still be intact. "What can I do for you?" "I came about the surplus property notice," Sylvie said. "Which one?" "The former pressed flower studio." The clerk's eyes moved once, quickly, to the cedar box in Sylvie's hands. "You have the parcel number?" Sylvie unfolded the grocery receipt, then the printed route, then found the legal notice she had copied by hand in the library. The paper had blurred slightly where rain had reached it, but the number remained readable. Marion took it and typed with 2 fingers, slow and exact. The printer behind her woke with a mechanical cough. "Structure only," Marion said, reading from the file. "Land ownership is clear enough for transfer, but the county makes no claim regarding fitness, safety, occupancy, or future enforcement." "Yes, ma'am." Marion's mouth tightened at that answer, not in displeasure, but in recognition of someone who had been saying yes to doors closing. "You understand this is not a house?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there are no active utilities on county record, no water meter, no electric service, no sewer connection. There may be an old well, but we do not certify wells through this office." "Yes, ma'am." You understand the roof was reported compromised after the winter storm file from 1987 and that the latest exterior inspection noted possible structural decay at the rear sill? Yes, ma'am. You understand the building remains under demolition review and purchase does not cancel the county's right to enforce removal if it is deemed unsafe? Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no refund? Yes, ma'am. Marian removed her glasses and set them on a square of blotter paper. Her eyes, without the lenses, looked softer and more tired. Child, she said, and then stopped herself. Because county officers had rules about the names strangers could give one another. Miss Whitaker, do you have somewhere else to stay? The surname hung there, ordinary and not ordinary. Sylvie kept one hand on the cedar box. No, ma'am. Marian looked toward the other clerk who was explaining a vehicle lien to the man in the raincoat. Then she lowered her voice. This transfer does not give you legal occupancy certification. I understand. That means I'm not telling you to sleep there. Yes, ma'am. It may not be safe. Yes, ma'am. The clerk studied her for another long moment, and the old fluorescent light made a pale line along the frames of her glasses. I am required to say all of that. I know. No, Marian said quietly. Most people do not. She rose from her chair and walked to a filing cabinet behind the partition. Her steps were careful but firm. She unlocked the top drawer, withdrew a brown folder and brought it back with both hands, as if paper itself could become heavy when it held a place that had been forgotten too long. Inside were forms, maps, disclosures, and a single black and white photograph clipped to the left side. The picture showed a narrow building with a glass roof pitch and a wooden sign hanging crooked above the door. The image had been taken in winter. Bare branches crossed the frame. Weeds had grown up along the foundation. Yet, even in that poor photograph, Sylvie saw the shape of a room built for light. Marian turned the folder toward her. Read the top page first. Sylvie read as much as she could, the words blurred and sharpened. Quitclaim, liability, nuisance abatement, known defects, prior use, no warranties expressed or implied. She signed where Marian placed small yellow arrows. Her signature looked thinner than usual. The clerk checked each page, stamped 2 in blue ink, then reached for the brass stamp beside her nameplate. It was heavier than it looked. Marian aligned the paper beneath it with both thumbs and pressed down. The stamp struck with a deep, official sound that moved through the counter and into Sylvie's wrists. Recorded. For 1 second, the office seemed to grow still around that word. Then the printer resumed its humming. Someone coughed near the chairs. Rain tapped the windows in small, repeated knocks. The consideration is $1, Marian said. Sylvie opened the birthday card inside the cedar box and removed the folded bill. It had softened at the creases. The ink was worn along Washington's face. She placed it on the counter and smoothed it once with her fingers. Marian did not pick it up immediately. She looked at the card, at the blue thread tied around the cedar box, and then at the bill. Do you want a receipt? Yes, ma'am. I would want one too. Marian printed the receipt and slid it across, then put the dollar into a drawer divided by coins and bills, but she did not place it with the others. She set it under a paperweight shaped like a little glass apple near the back of the drawer, separate and flat. Sylvie noticed. She said nothing. The clerk copied directions onto a county map in pencil, her handwriting slanted and exact. You will go out Sims Way, then toward Hastings. Do not take the first private lane with the blue gate. Keep going until the pavement narrows. There is a row of walnut trees before the gravel spur. The studio sits behind what used to be a larger property, but the main house burned down decades ago. Only the outbuilding remained. She marked the route with deliberate strokes. There is a neighbour on one side, the Brannans, but they keep to themselves. Their dog sounds meaner than he is. On the other side is an empty orchard parcel. Watch the ditch after rain. It drops deeper than it looks. Yes, ma'am. Marian paused with the pencil still in her hand. Whitaker. Sylvie looked up. The clerk said the name again, not as a question this time, but as a memory brought closer to the light. There used to be a woman with that surname who came through this office years ago, brought plant papers for copying, pressed specimens, I think. She had a way of labelling things better than our surveyors did. Sylvie's fingers closed around the edge of the counter. Marion continued carefully watching her face. She was older than you, silver hair, wore a grey coat. She once corrected a spelling on a county weed notice and made our department head apologize to a fern. That was the first time all morning Sylvie nearly laughed. It came out as a breath and then vanished. "She was my grandmother," she said. I wondered. The office lights hummed outside. A car moved through rainwater with a soft hiss. Marion set the pencil down. She asked about that studio once. Sylvie did not answer. Not to buy it, Marion said. At least not in any official way. She wanted to know whether its records survived. She said places that held plant work were too often treated like sheds when they were closer to libraries. The sentence landed with such quiet force that Sylvie had to lower her eyes. "When was this?" she asked. "Oh, 15 years ago at least, maybe more. I remember because she brought me a pressed violet after my husband died, not framed, just in a little envelope. She said violets did not cure grief, but they could keep company with it." Marion turned slightly and reached into the shallow drawer beneath her keyboard. For a moment, Sylvie thought she meant to show her the violet, but the clerk's hand stopped before touching whatever lay inside. Some kept things were not for display. She was a careful woman, Marion said. "Yes, ma'am." The clerk slid the folder's copy toward Sylvie. "Then you may be the right sort of foolish for this." The words were stern, but the corners of her mouth had softened. Sylvie folded the deed copy and placed it inside Eleanor's field notebook, though she had promised herself not to use that name aloud in this office and did not. The cedar box closed with a faint click. Marion handed her a county envelope, 2 photocopied maps and a yellow carbon receipt for the $1. At the door, the clerk called after her, "Miss Whitaker." Sylvie turned. "If anyone asks, I told you the truth." "Yes, ma'am. And if the Brannan dog comes at you, stand still. He respects stillness." Sylvie nodded once, then stepped back into the rain. The walk to the property began through town, but town loosened quickly. The storefronts gave way to houses with deep porches, then to repair shops, boat storage yards, fenced lots, and stands of alder losing their leaves. She passed a marine supply store with coils of rope hanging in the window, a closed antique shop with a porcelain sink displayed beside a stack of oars, and a bakery venting warm bread into the cold air so suddenly that she had to stop and swallow. Her stomach answered hard enough to hurt. She kept walking. Sims Way carried traffic in long wet ribbons. Cars passed with their headlights on, though it was midday. Beyond the shoulder, blackberry canes climbed over old fencing, their leaves dark red and shining. The road rose toward the west, and the bay appeared now and then between buildings. A grey sheet of water pulled tight under the weather. At a crosswalk, an older man in a canvas jacket nodded to her cedar box. "Instrument?" "No, sir." "Looks precious." She looked down at it. "It is." He accepted that answer without requiring the rest. The farther she went, the more the town sound thinned. No theatre posters, no bookstore windows, no cafe chairs being unfolded onto sidewalks, only tires, gulls, wind in fir branches, and once the long metallic cry of something from the boatyard behind her. When she turned toward Hastings Avenue, the pavement narrowed and the houses grew more scattered, each one holding its own weather. A woman in a green rain slicker was raking leaves from a ditch in front of a white house with blue trim. She stopped and watched Sylvie pass, not unfriendly, only aware that strangers on foot were uncommon there, especially strangers carrying all they owned. Smoke came from a chimney behind a stand of hemlock. A mailbox shaped like a tiny barn leaned on its post. Somewhere unseen, a dog began barking with the deep, committed voice of an animal who believed property lines were moral law. Sylvie checked the map. The row of walnut trees appeared after another bend, black-limbed and bare, their branches reaching over the road like hands that had known many winters. Wet leaves lay beneath them in a dark, slick mat. The gravel spur hid between the third and fourth trees, marked by 2 leaning posts and no sign. She turned in. The dog barked louder from the neighbouring property. A large brown shape moved behind a wire fence, then stopped. Remembering Marion's warning, Sylvie stood still. The dog lowered his head, barked twice more, and then, as if disappointed by her lack of argument, trotted away toward a shed. Beyond the fence, a man split kindling under a tarp without looking over. The axe rose and fell with the slow rhythm of someone who had no need to hurry. On the opposite side, the orchard parcel lay empty, its trees abandoned into strange shapes, apple limbs crossing and recrossing like old handwriting. The spur road was not much more than 2 tire tracks with grass between them. Rain had gathered in shallow ruts. Sylvie walked along the raised centre, placing her feet carefully. Blackberry vines tugged at her coat. A rusted gate sagged open ahead, one hinge broken, the other holding out of habit. Past the gate, the pressed flower studio came into view. It stood alone in a clearing bordered by fir, walnut, and the remains of an orchard gone wild. The building was longer than she expected, perhaps 28 feet from front to back and 16 across, built of narrow cedar boards, weathered to a silver grey that darkened near the ground. A low stone foundation lifted it just enough above the wet earth to show 3 uneven steps at the front. The roof rose in a single north-facing glass pitch over the workroom, while the front portion wore cedar shingles furred with moss. One brick chimney leaned slightly at the rear corner, not enough to fall, but enough to make a person notice. The sign still hung over the front door. Aster and fern botanical pressing. Gilded frames, memorial flowers, field specimens. The words had faded until they seemed less painted than remembered. One corner of the sign had dropped lower than the other, and a bird's nest, emptied for the season, sat in the crook of the iron bracket. 3 windows faced the clearing. 2 were cracked. One held only a triangle of glass at the top, with a sheet of plywood nailed badly across the rest. The door was painted once in green, now worn almost bare where hands had pushed it open through the years. A brass knob remained dark and pitted. Beneath the eaves, dried vines clung to old nails. Sylvie stood at the edge of the clearing for a long while. There was no welcome in the ordinary sense. No porch light, no smoke, no sound from within. The place had the honest neglect of something not visited by those who wished to sell it, only by weather, birds, and time. Yet the north glass still caught what light the day offered and held it softly, turning the rain on its surface into silver threads. She approached the steps. The first board gave under her foot, not breaking but warning. The second held. She shifted her weight to the edge where the grain looked darker and stronger. At the door she set down one bag and tried the key Marion had given her. It did not turn at first. She drew it out, wiped it on her sleeve, inserted it again, and lifted the knob slightly the way one does with aged doors. The lock gave with a small reluctant click. When she pushed inward, the door opened 3 inches and stopped against something on the floor. Sylvie leaned her shoulder into it. A scrape answered from inside. Dust rose through the gap, dry and floral, carrying a faint lavender scent so unexpected that she stood still with her hand on the door. Not fresh lavender, not sachet lavender, the older kind, brittle and pale, left in drawers for years and still offering what it could. She pushed again, slowly, until the object behind the door shifted enough for her to enter. The front room was colder than outside. It held a counter along the left wall, a set of white wooden shelves, 3 empty frame racks, and a narrow iron stove with a cracked mica window. The floorboards were wide pine, grey with dust near the door, but honey-coloured where old rugs had protected them. Against the far wall stood a glass front cabinet, its panes clouded, its shelves lined with brown paper. A broom lay on the floor where it must have fallen years before. The straw bristles bent to one side like grass after wind. Light entered reluctantly through the front windows, fractured by cracks and dirt. It touched the hanging frames on the right wall, and Sylvie saw that many were still occupied. Pressed flowers. They hung behind dusty glass in white painted wooden frames, arranged in careful panels. Ferns opened like green lace gone brown with time. Sprays of tiny blossoms faded to cream. Grasses crossed and labelled. A single rose flattened into a dark red memory. Some labels had browned. Some ink had vanished, but the hands that made them had been exact. Sylvie did not touch the frames. She only stood among them. Rain ticking behind her through the open door and let the room come into her slowly. The sound inside was different from any shelter she had known. Not safe exactly, not yet, but enclosed. The walls answered wind with small wooden complaints. Somewhere in the roof, water found a path and dropped into a metal pan with a patient note. Plink, then silence, then plink again. She closed the door. The air changed at once, darker, more private. In the corner near the counter, she found the object that had blocked entry, a wooden crate filled with warped mapboard and narrow strips of gilded moulding. She moved it aside. The effort made her hands tremble, so she sat on the lower step of the counter and breathed through her nose until the room steadied. There was a back room beyond a half-opened sliding door. She waited before entering it. That was something Eleanor had taught her without making it a rule. A place should be allowed to show itself in layers. First the public room, then the workroom. First the doorway, then the table. First the light, then the dust in it. When Sylvie finally crossed the threshold, the back room opened under the north glass. Even in rain, the light there was clearer. It fell from the slanted roof in a broad, colourless wash over work tables, shelves, stacked presses, and long drawers built into the wall. The room smelled of dry paper, lavender, cedar, and the mineral cold of old glass. A line of white painted racks ran along one side, still holding dozens of specimen sheets clipped upright. Some had curled, others remained flat, their plant forms suspended in a quiet so complete it seemed almost deliberate. There were tools left in place. A bone folder, tweezers in a porcelain cup, a small brush with pale bristles, rolls of linen tape, a shallow dish with flakes of gold leaf sealed beneath a tarnished lid, 2 bottles of adhesive gone amber, a ledger closed on the centre table, its cover warped but intact. At the far end of the room stood the botanical drying press. It was larger than anything Sylvie had seen in her grandmother's cottage, not a tabletop press, but a standing apparatus built of maple and iron, nearly as tall as her shoulder and wide as a church door. 4 threaded rods rose at the corners, each fitted with iron wheels for tightening. Between the boards were layers of press paper, blotters, ventilators, and what looked like several removable frames. The central wing, a thick wooden plate set into the body of the press, bore a carved aster inside a circle. It looked less like equipment than furniture from a vanished discipline. Sylvie stood before it with her arms close to her sides. The press gave nothing away. Dust lay evenly across the top. A strand of spider silk trembled between one iron wheel and the wall. She was too cold to examine it, too hungry to think clearly, too newly arrived to open the heart of the room. So she began with what the body required. She checked the roof leaks first, placing 3 containers beneath the drops, the metal pan already there, a chipped basin from under the counter, and an old enamel pot with blue flowers around the rim. In the front room she found a stack of burlap sacks, stiff but dry, and shook them outside beneath the eaves until dust lifted from them in dull clouds. In a cabinet beneath the counter were 2 candles, one broken, one whole, and a box of wooden matches gone soft at the edges but still usable after she tested 3. The stove would not be lit. Not that night. She knew enough not to trust a cold chimney in a condemned building without looking first, but the candles gave a small circle of sight, and the burlap sacks made a layer between her body and the floor. There was no running water, only rain caught from the roof in a barrel outside the back door, dark with leaves. She did not drink it. She had filled a plastic bottle at the library before leaving, and had half of it left. She took 3 careful swallows, then stopped. Hunger moved under her ribs like a hand turning pages. From her bag she took the last roll she had been saving, hard at the edges, and ate half. The other half she wrapped again in paper and placed inside the cedar box, because mice were likely and the box still closed tight. Dark came early under cloud. The studio changed after sunset. The front windows became black panels holding the faint reflection of her candle. The hanging flowers on the wall disappeared first into colourlessness, then into shape, then into the general dark. In the back room, the north glass held a paler darkness, and rain stroked it steadily. Sylvie made her bed on the front room floor, away from the soft back sill and beneath the counter where the walls seemed least exposed to draughts. She kept her coat on, One bag became a pillow. The cedar box rested against her stomach under both arms. The deed copy lay inside the field notebook, which lay inside the box which lay beneath the blue thread. Before lying down, she walked once more to the back room with the candle shielded in her hand. The work tables waited, the specimen racks waited, the large press stood in its corner, patient and exact, its iron wheels dark against the pale wood. She could see the carved aster on the central wing, now only when the candle leaned toward it. A drop fell into the enamel pot, then another. She thought of the county clerk's drawer, the dollar beneath the glass apple. She thought of the bus driver pointing with his gloved hand. She thought of the librarian's pencil, the route marked against road names that changed, the dog who respected stillness, the woman raking leaves from the ditch who had watched but not called out. No one had saved her, but several people had moved one small thing out of her way. That was different. It was also enough for one night. She returned to the front room and blew out the candle. The smoke rose bitter and brief. In the dark, the studio made itself known by sound. Rain on glass, water dropping into pans, wood contracting in the cold, a faint rustle inside the wall that might have been a mouse or only the building remembering wind. Sylvie lay still until her eyes adjusted. The front door was a darker rectangle. The cracked windows held no light. Beneath her shoulder, the pine floor was hard, but it did not ask her to leave. Sometime in the night, the rain slowed. The silence that followed was not empty. It settled over the counters, the frames, the stove, and the sealed press in the back room with the weight of a blanket placed by careful hands. The studio had been waiting. By the third morning, Sylvie knew which floorboards complained honestly and which ones lied. The one beside the front counter made a sharp report under the left heel, but it held. The board near the back sill sounded hollow and had a dark seam along the grain, so she crossed that corner only by stepping on the joist line she had found with the toe of her boot. In the workroom, the boards beneath the north glass gave small dry ticks when the day warmed, not from weakness, but from expansion. The studio was teaching her its language slowly, with no kindness except accuracy. She marked the dangerous places with strips torn from a brown paper wrapper. She did not have tape enough to waste, so she weighted the strips with bits of broken moulding from the crate that had blocked the door. Each morning she walked the same path from her bed under the counter to the back door, then to the front room, then to the work table, learning the safe islands of the floor the way a child learns stones across a creek. The first problem was water. Behind the studio, half hidden under blackberry cane and sword fern, she found the old well. It was not a deep stone well from picture books, but a capped pipe rising from a square of cracked concrete, with a hand pump attached by rusted bolts. The pump handle moved only 2 inches at first, then stopped with a sound like a throat refusing speech. She cleared leaves from the base, scraped mud from the bolts with a broken dinner knife, and poured a little rainwater down the priming cup after reading the faint cast letters on the pump body. On the 6th pull, it gave a cough. On the 11th, brown water spat onto the concrete. She stepped back and let it run. The first water came rusty, then tea-coloured, then nearly clear with a mineral smell that made her think of cold stones. She filled the chipped basin and carried it inside without drinking. Water could look clean and still carry illness. Eleanor had said that once beside a creek in summer, holding Sylvie's wrist before she bent to taste, so the well became washing water only, until she could find someone to ask. The second problem was the outhouse. It stood beyond the walnut trees, a leaning structure with cedar shakes and a half-moon cut into the door, more weathered than charming. Sylvie approached it with a stick in one hand and caution in the other. The hinges protested. Inside, spiders had claimed the corners, and a raccoon or some other practical animal had nested in old leaves beneath the bench. She cleaned it because she had no better option. She wrapped her hand in burlap, cleared the nest, swept the floor with the bent broom, and left the door open all afternoon to air. By evening she had a place to sleep, water she would not drink, and a necessary building she could enter without flinching. That was not comfort. It was a beginning. She spent the first 3 days in a kind of deliberate poverty of movement. Nothing was opened unless it needed opening. Nothing was moved unless she first knew where she would put it. The studio had held itself together for decades by being left alone, and she did not trust her ignorance enough to disturb it quickly. She swept the front room in narrow sections, raising dust that smelled of paper, lavender, and mouse droppings. She wore her scarf tied over her nose. The dust made her eyes water and turned the cuffs of her coat grey. From the counters she removed fallen plaster flakes, dead flies, and curls of dry birch bark that some bird had carried down the chimney. She found 3 more candles in a drawer, 2 sewing needles, a roll of linen thread, a cracked magnifying glass, and a ledger whose pages she was still afraid to open with dirty hands. Every evening Cold entered before dark and sat low in the room. She could not light the stove yet. The chimney waited like a question with soot inside it. Her meals were half rolls, peanut butter, and once an apple she found beneath a roadside tree, bruised but not rotten. She washed her face in well water, rubbed her hands dry against her coat, and slept with her breath tucked inside the collar. On the 4th day, she walked to the hardware store. It took most of the morning. The road had dried in places, and a pale light moved behind the clouds without breaking through. She carried the county map, the empty water bottle, and the yellow receipt in her pocket, though there was nothing left on it that could feed or warm her. The cedar box stayed hidden under the front counter, wrapped in burlap and placed behind the crate of warped mapboard. Leaving it made her feel divided, but carrying it to town would draw eyes, and there were things the studio had to begin holding for her. A hand-painted sign at the edge of the commercial strip read, "Hadley Hardware and Feed." The building was longer than it looked from the road, with galvanized tubs stacked outside, seed packets turning slowly on a rack near the door, and a row of snow shovels hanging from hooks, though winter had not yet settled fully. When Sylvie entered, a bell rang above her head with a clear, plain note. The store smelled of pine shavings, oil, rubber boots, and coffee. Nails were kept in open bins along the right wall, each labelled in black marker: 6D finish, 8D common, galvanized roofing, masonry. Copper pipe hung from ceiling brackets. A glass case near the counter held pocket knives, sharpening stones, brass hinges, and 2 old compasses that looked as if they had been there since before prices became stickers. In the back, sacks of feed stood in a neat wall, and beyond them a grey cat slept on a coil of rope as if employed by the county to inspect stillness. The man behind the counter was tall and narrow, with hands enlarged by years of work and a white beard cut close along his jaw. His left eyebrow had a notch through it, and one lens of his glasses was held at the corner by a small loop of copper wire. He wore a canvas apron darkened where tools had rubbed against it. When he looked at Sylvie, he did not begin with suspicion. He began with her shoes. "Those have been wet more than once," he said. "Yes, sir. Bad habit for shoes." "I know. Worse habit for feet." She had no answer for that. He set down a pencil. "I'm Amos Hadley." Sylvie Whitaker. At the surname, he did not react the way Marion had, but he did pause, which in such men was nearly the same as a question. "You the one who bought the flower place?" "Yes, sir." The grey cat opened one eye. Amos leaned back slightly and looked toward the front window, as if the studio were visible down the road, if one knew the correct angle. "That building should have come down or been cared for. It got neither. I need to keep it standing. That is different from wanting it standing." "Yes, sir." He took his glasses off and cleaned them with the hem of his apron, leaving a smudge that had probably lived there for years. "You got money?" "No, sir." "Tools?" "Not enough to name." "Experience?" She swallowed. "Some with handwork, not with buildings." "Most buildings are handwork. They are just less forgiving." He came around the counter without hurry and walked to a shelf beside the stovepipe fittings. From a lower rack, he pulled a thin paperback book with a faded cover, Home Repairs for Rural Outbuildings, Revised Edition, 1972. The pages were soft at the corners and furred with use. "This is outdated in places," he said. "Good in others. Ignore the wiring chapter. Read the chimney section twice, then again while looking at the chimney. Do not trust diagrams more than bricks." "I can't pay for it." "I did not say I was selling it." Sylvie held the book but did not close her fingers around it. Amos returned to the counter and opened a small black ledger with marbled edges. It was not the computer register near the card machine. It was older, ruled by hand with names written in columns. I can carry a credit account for repair materials, not for candy, not for candles, not for anything decorative. Nails, patch, rope, gloves if your hands are bleeding, and tools borrowed back if you leave. I don't know when I can pay. Neither do I. That does not seem wise. No, Amos said. It seems local. She looked down at the ledger. Several names had lines through them. Others had balances marked, paid in a different ink. Why would you do that? He capped his pen. Because the county sold you a problem for $1 and will call it your fault if it falls. Because Marion Voss called before you got here and told me to be honest. Because your grandmother once brought my wife pressed snowdrops when she was too sick to go outside. Pick whichever reason lets you sleep. Sylvie looked away first. The stove in the store clicked softly as metal shifted with heat. A man in the back called for a price on baling twine, and Amos answered without turning. Write what you need, he said. Then we will remove half of it because you cannot carry half of what you think you need. The list took an hour. Amos asked questions she could answer only partly, then taught her how to answer the rest. Roof leaks first, but temporary. Chimney inspection before fire. Floor rot avoided, not fixed yet. Water tested later, not trusted. Window gaps blocked enough to slow weather. Not sealed tight where trapped moisture would do more harm. On brown wrapping paper he wrote prices in pencil. 1 pair brown jersey gloves, 89 cents, carried on account. 1 small wire brush, $1.35. 1 narrow cold chisel used, $1.10. 1 second-hand hand broom, 75 cents. 10 feet of light chain, $2.40. For chimney brush, improvising if needed. 1 stovepipe mirror, cracked at edge, no charge if returned. 1 dust mask, paper, 22 cents. 1 pound 8D common nails, $1.18. Half-pound galvanized roofing nails, 96 cents. 6 feet rolled flashing scrap, $1.50. 1 tube roof patch, black asphalt, $2.25. 2 cotton rags, free from the bin. 1 borrowed ladder, return before snow. Do not use the roof patch like frosting, Amos said. People do that when afraid. Fear is expensive and messy. Yes, sir. For the chimney, you need to know whether the flue is blocked before anything else. Birds, nests, brick fall, creosote. You have a stove. Iron. Small. Cracked. The little window is cracked. Mica, not glass. Leave it for now. It will leak light more than smoke. He wrapped the chisel and brush in newspaper. Then he took from beneath the counter a metal canister with a screw lid and placed it beside the other things. Coffee can, he said. For creosote scrapings, do not dump them under the porch. They will stink every time it rains. Sylvie opened her mouth to thank him, but the words felt too small, and saying too much could make kindness retreat. Amos seemed to understand. Bring the ladder back by Sunday, he said. Yes, sir. And Miss Whitaker. She stopped with the bundle against her chest. If the chimney scares you, let it, then look again. The borrowed ladder was heavier than any grief object she had carried. Amos tied her supplies in a canvas sack and lashed the sack to the ladder with twine so both could be dragged and shifted by stages along the road. The walk back took nearly twice as long. Twice she had to sit on the ditch edge and rest her forearms once the ladder slid and nearly took her down with it, but a passing woman in a pickup stopped long enough to help her lift it back to balance. At the studio, she leaned the ladder under the eave and waited until her breathing settled. Then she read the chimney chapter. She read it once on the front floor with her back against the counter and the daylight fading. She read it again beside the stove, looking at the pipe collar, the damper, the ash clean-out, and the soot stains along the wall behind it. She read it a third time the next morning while standing outside, studying the chimney bricks through the branches. The method was slow and dirty, and that suited her because fear had less room when hands were occupied. First she cleared around the stove, she laid burlap on the floor and set the coffee can, wire brush, cold chisel, rags and borrowed mirror within reach. She checked the stovepipe joints by hand, finding 2 loose screws and one place where old furnace cement had cracked to powder. She did not remove the pipe. Amos had warned against making a repair larger than the day could hold. Next, she opened the stove door and reached inside with the mirror angled upward. The flue throat was black but not closed. She saw a wedge of twig near the bend and a shine of glaze along one side that the book identified as creosote, dangerous when thick and hungry for flame. She tied the wire brush to the light chain with linen thread first, then distrust changed her mind, and she retied it with 2 loops of picture wire found in a drawer. The chimney brush Amos had wanted to lend was too large for the old flue, so she made do with what could pass through. She climbed the ladder outside with the chain coiled over one shoulder and the coffee can tucked in the crook of her arm. The ladder feet sank slightly into wet ground, so she climbed down, found 2 flat stones near the foundation, and reset the feet. The second climb held. At the chimney crown, her hands began to shake from height and cold. The top bricks were damp, their mortar recessed and soft in places, but they did not move under light pressure. She removed an old bird guard, bent and rusted, then lowered the brush into the flue until it caught. She did not force it. She lifted, turned, lowered again. Soot loosened beneath her. She heard it fall through the dark inside the chimney with a dry, whispering sound. The smell rose quickly, bitter and tarry. She worked the brush down in short strokes, never more than a foot at a time, turning the chain between her gloved hands. When the brush met resistance, she marked the chain with chalk from the workroom and climbed down to check the stove opening. A clot of twigs and black flakes had fallen onto the burlap. The nest came out in pieces: dry grass, feathers, charred leaf bits from some older attempt at fire. She collected everything in the coffee can and carried it outside, then returned. The work took 6 hours the first day and 2 the next. Soot entered her sleeves, her hair, the lines beside her nose. Creosote came off in glossy black scales like broken beetle shell. By the time the mirror showed a narrow path of light from top to bottom, her shoulders had gone heavy and her hands felt enlarged inside the gloves. She did not light the fire then. She waited 1 more day because the book advised patience after cleaning, and because Amos's voice had settled in her mind beside Eleanor's, each of them stern in different disciplines. On the following evening, after checking the damper, clearing ash, and opening the front door a little for draught, Sylvie built her first fire in the studio. She used dry twigs from beneath the thickest fir, a twist of brown paper, and 2 short pieces of split kindling. Amos had tucked into the canvas sack without mentioning. She struck 1 match. It broke. She struck another. The flame shook at the tip, as if uncertain of its assignment. She cupped it carefully and lowered it to the paper. Smoke came first, grey and doubtful. Then the kindling caught. She watched the chimney more than the flame. Smoke entered the room in 1 thin ribbon, then changed its mind and drew upward. The stove began to tick. The cracked mica window showed a faint orange pulse. Sylvie sat on the floor 3 feet away, ready to smother, run or pray, whichever the room required. The fire held. The first warmth did not arrive as comfort, it came as information. Her fingers began to hurt as they thawed. Her ears burned. The damp in her coat lifted into the air. The room gave back smells the cold had been hiding: cedar, dust, old glue, iron, lavender, mouse, paper. For supper she made what could barely be called a meal, and ate it as if it deserved a tablecloth. In the enamel pot she warmed well water to wash the outside of a potato. Amos had given her from a sack split open in the store. She sliced it thin with Eleanor's scissors, cooked it on a dented metal tray balanced above the stove, and sprinkled it with a pinch of salt from a paper packet found in her bag. The slices stuck, browned unevenly, and tasted of smoke and iron. She ate every piece. Afterward, she warmed the last half roll on the stove edge, and for the first time since the dormitory door notice, food entered her body without haste. She did not speak. The room did not require speech. Firelight moved along the lower edges of the framed flowers and made their shadows tremble on the wall. Only after the chimney had proven itself through 2 careful fires did Sylvie begin the inventory of the workroom. She made the inventory in the ledger from the centre table, but not on the original pages. Those belonged to whoever had kept them. Instead, she found unused pages at the back, numbered them in pencil, and began with the north wall. Work table 1, pine top, scarred by blades, stable after wedge placed under rear leg. 1 porcelain cup containing 8 fine tweezers, 3 usable, 1 badger hairbrush shedding, 2 bone folders, 1 cracked, 1 glassine packet marked gold leaf, contents fragmented but dry, 1 small bottle labelled methyl cellulose, contents solidified, not usable, 1 jar of wheat paste, spoiled, discarded, outside in sealed pit after mice found it. Shelf above work table 23 sheets Japan paper, foxed at edges, center usable on 12, 4 rolls linen hinging tape, brittle 1 packet black photo corners, 2 brass hanging wires, 1 wooden burnisher with handle worn by thumb. Long drawer 1, matte board, cream, warped. Long drawer 2, specimen labels cut by hand, blank. Long drawer 3, dried lavender bundles, faded but fragrant. Long drawer 4, empty except mouse nest, removed. Specimen rack A, grasses, sedges and rushes. Rack B, cultivated memorial flowers, many labelled with names and dates of people unknown to her. Rack C, ferns. Rack D, field specimens from Olympic Peninsula sites, years ranging from 1938 to 1962. She paused there. The years made the room older than neglect. They gave it a working life. She did not read each label, only noted their presence. The anti-compression of grief, though she had no phrase for it, required that some things remain unopened until a mind could carry them. Every new drawer was a room. Every room had weather. The cabinet near the front held frame samples, white, black, walnut, gilt. The gilt had tarnished where air entered, but beneath the dust it still held a low glow like sunlight under water. A lower shelf contained glass panes wrapped in paper, and one was marked UV block in pencil. Sylvie knew enough from Eleanor to touch that pane only at the edges. On the second afternoon of inventory, she came to the standing press. She had avoided it without admitting avoidance. It occupied the far end of the workroom with a gravity larger than its size. The carved aster in the central wing had gathered dust in its grooves. The iron wheels at the corners were dark with age but not frozen. When Sylvie placed her palm against the outer board, the maple felt cold and close-grained. She wrote first. Standing botanical drying press, maple and iron, approximately 5 feet high, 4 feet wide, multiple layers. Condition unknown, central wing carved with aster mark. Then she began to examine it. The top wheel turned a 1/4 inch after effort, then stopped. She did not force it. The lower wheels gave slightly, one by one, with a complaint from the threads. The press plates were stacked thickly, alternating wood, blotter, corrugated ventilator and felted pads stiff from age. She loosened only enough to remove the top layers. The first papers contained nothing but dust. The second set held 3 ruined stems, grey and powdery. The third held a sheet of pressed bluebells, so faded they had become almost transparent. The label read, Field Edge, Marrowstone, May 1949. She placed it aside under a clean sheet and continued. After an hour, she noticed that the central wing did not behave like the other plates. It was thicker, for one thing, but thickness alone meant little. It was also colder. When she tapped the removable plates with the handle of the bone folder, they answered with a plain wooden knock. When she tapped the central wing, the sound came back duller at the top, sharper near the right edge, and nearly hollow just below the carved aster. Sylvie stopped. She tapped again, not harder, only more carefully. Top left. Solid. Bottom left. Solid. Lower centre. Dense. Right centre. A quiet answer, held back. She wrote the pattern in the ledger. Then she tested weight. The removable plates lifted when loosened. The central wing did not. That matched the construction if it were fixed into the frame. But there was a small irregularity along the right side, a seam finer than a pencil line. Dust had settled into it and hidden it until her tapping had brought her face close. She ran a needle along the seam. The needle caught at one point. Not a crack. A join. At the bottom of the carved aster, beneath one petal, was a cedar disc no larger than a nickel, fitted so carefully into the maple that only the changing grain betrayed it. She brushed dust away with the badger brush. The disc did not move under her fingernail. She tried the needle, then stopped. Old hidden things could be ruined by impatient hands. Instead, she searched around the press. Under the feet, around the base, behind the rear brace, nothing. She lay on the floor with the candle in one hand and looked beneath the machine. Dust, mouse droppings, a dead beetle, and the shadowed underside of the central pedestal. Then she saw the key. Not openly, not where a person would see it while standing. It was tucked beneath the front base rail, held by two tiny iron clips darkened with the same dust as the wood around them. The key was long, brass, and narrow, with a hollow barrel and a bow shaped like a simple aster. It had been placed there by someone who expected only a kneeling person to find it. Sylvie stayed on the floor for several seconds before touching it. When she removed it from the clips, dust fell into her sleeve. The key was heavier than it looked. She sat back on her heels, the candle flame moving in her breath, and looked at the central wing. There was no sudden music in the room, no change in the weather. Outside, rainwater continued to drop from the eaves. The dog at the neighbouring property barked once, then lost interest in whatever he had condemned. The studio remained its, but something had shifted. Sylvie pressed the cedar disc again, this time with the blunt end of the key. It sank a fraction and turned. A small brass cover, hidden beneath the disc, opened enough to reveal a keyhole. Her hands became very careful. The key entered smoothly. She turned it to the left and felt resistance, then a release so soft it might have been imagined. Along the right edge of the central wing, the fine seam widened. A panel moved outward less than half an inch. The wood had swollen with age, and the hidden compartment did not open easily. Sylvie worked slowly, easing the panel with both hands, never pulling from one corner. The old join protested in small dry sounds. A flake of dust fell from the carved aster. Then the central panel opened like the cover of a book. Inside was a narrow cavity lined with cedar. The scent came out first. Not lavender now. Cedar, paper, iron, and something faintly medicinal like old camphor sealed too long. The cavity held packages wrapped in oilcloth, tied with cotton tape. There were 5 bundles and one small tin box wedged at the bottom. Each bundle had a paper label sewn to the wrapping with dark thread. The handwriting was not Eleanor's. It belonged to someone older in manner, more angular, every letter standing straight as a fence post. Sylvie did not remove them all at once. She took the top package and laid it on the work table, then she closed the panel most of the way, as if the cavity deserved privacy between removals. The cotton tape had stiffened. She untied it by working a needle beneath the knot until it loosened. Cutting felt wrong. Inside the first oilcloth were tools. Not valuable in the bright sense, but valuable in the hand. A pair of fine botanical forceps wrapped in chamois, a small ivory folder yellowed with age, a brass magnifier in a worn leather case, a gilding knife with a handle dark from use, 2 agate burnishers, one shaped for lines, one for broadleaf, a packet of needles sorted by size and labelled in ink. The second bundle held raw materials, packets of gold leaf between rouge papers, strips of linen, sheets of thin Japan paper, several glassine envelopes, and a small jar of dry powdered adhesive sealed with wax. On the label someone had written, "For work that must last longer than the hand that makes it." Sylvie sat down after reading that. The stove was unlit, and the workroom was cold enough that her breath moved in front of her, but her palms had grown damp. The third and fourth bundles were specimen folios. She opened them only far enough to see the first pages, then stopped because the sight required more knowledge than she had ready. Each folio held pressed plants mounted with almost severe delicacy, the stems fixed to paper by hair-thin strips, the labels dense with place names, dates, elevation, soil, exposure, and field notes, some common names she knew, others she did not, besides several labels, in later pencil. Someone had written words that made the room feel suddenly larger and more fragile. Extirpated locally. No recent confirmed sightings. Possibly extinct. The dates ranged from the 1930s to the early 1960s. There were 48 entries in the index page at the front of the first folio, each numbered, each cross-referenced by habitat: Olympic rain shadow prairie, coastal bluff, wet meadow near vanished creek, serpentine outcrop, abandoned logging road colonized by alder. She did not read further, not yet. The fifth bundle was heavier. It contained a flat packet of envelopes, a folded cloth, and beneath that, stacks of money wrapped in paper bands that had gone tan with age. Sylvie stared without understanding. Currency, when found in drawers or coat pockets, looks like money. Currency sealed in oilcloth for generations looks at first like evidence. The bills were older, smaller in design, some silver certificates, some Federal Reserve notes, all flattened by years of pressure. The paper bands were marked in the same angular handwriting. $500, $1,000, $2,000. She touched the edge of one stack with one finger, then drew her hand back. There was no one in the room to accuse her, and still she felt accused by the size of what had been hidden. The tin box remained in the cavity. She removed it last. It was rectangular, black once, now rubbed to dull metal along the corners. The lid resisted, then opened with a sound like a held breath leaving. Inside were coins wrapped in cloth, one medal, and a folded paper sealed with a wafer of red wax. She did not open the paper. The coins she placed in a row because counting was a way to stay present. 3 mercury dimes, 7 wheat pennies, 4 buffalo nickels, their dates worn but visible under the magnifier, 2 Walking Liberty $half, 1 silver quarter from 1932, several ordinary pennies from later years, perhaps added by a hand that had opened the box after the first sealing. Loose change totaled 73 cents after she counted twice. The medal lay beneath the cloth. It was a World War II victory medal, the ribbon faded but intact, the bronze disc showing the figure of liberation standing with one foot on a helmet. On the back, the year 1945 appeared in the inscription. Tucked behind the ribbon was a small card, E.R. Whitaker, carried home by A.M., November 1946. Sylvie did not know those initials. She placed the medal back on the cloth and covered it with both hands for a moment. Not in prayer exactly, but in acknowledgement that metal can arrive in a room carrying more silence than money. Only then did she count the bills. She counted on the work table under the north glass, with the door closed, the curtains of rain drawn across the roof, and the stove unlit because she could not bear flame near old paper. She made stacks by denomination, $1 silver certificates, $5 notes, 10s, 20s, a few 50s, no hundreds. Whoever had saved it had done so not from sudden wealth, but from years of separating, folding, and keeping. The first count came to $23,390. She counted again. $23,400. She checked the paper bands, the envelopes, the cloth beneath them, the amount held. The cash proper came to $23,400, and the loose coins in the tin added 73 cents from some smaller human habit of saving everything. The number did not enter her all at once. It stood at the far side of the table like a person whose face she could not yet read. She had owned $1 2 days before. She had eaten warmed potato as if it were a feast. Her shoes were still damp at the seams. The county could still condemn the building. The roof still leaked. The rear sill still softened. The well still needed testing. Nothing about the studio had become easy. But the difference between no choice and a narrow choice had opened. She folded the money back into its papers exactly as she had found it. She returned the coins to their cloth, the medal to its place, and the sealed paper to the tin box without breaking the wax. The letter, if that was what it was, had waited in darkness for longer than she had been alive. It could wait one more night while she learned how to receive it without greed. She placed the tools and materials on the table, covered the folios with clean paper, and returned none of it to the compartment. Then she closed the hidden panel until the seam became nearly invisible again, leaving the key on the table beside the tin box. Her hands were black with dust and cedar oil. She washed them in the basin, changed the water, and washed them again. The water turned grey, then pale. She dried her fingers on a cotton rag and noticed that one knuckle had split open during the work. A thin line of blood marked the skin, no wider than a plant stem. Night had come while she counted. The front room was almost dark, and the frames on the wall had withdrawn into shadow. She did not light a candle. She took the tin box in both hands, walked through the back door and stepped into the clearing behind the studio. The rain had stopped. Clouds moved low over the trees, but westward, beyond the orchard and the darker line of firs, the sky had thinned. A pale seam of evening lay above the direction of the water. She could not see the bay from the studio. Not fully, but she could smell it when the wind shifted. Salt, kelp, cold distance. She walked to the walnut row and stood beneath the branches. The ground was soft, leaves clung to her boots. Somewhere beyond the fence, the Brannan dog gave a single low bark, recognized her by now as part of the weather, and settled again. From the road came no headlights, no voices, only the wet drip of trees after rain. Sylvie held the tin box against her coat. She did not open the sealed paper. She did not make plans. She did not imagine rescue, school, repayment, revenge, or any bright future that would have turned the moment false. Instead, she watched the dark gather in the orchard, watched one drop fall from a walnut twig to a leaf below it, watched the studio windows take the last grey light into themselves. The money was not a miracle. It was someone's labour, hidden with deliberate care. The folios were not treasure in the way stories usually meant treasure. They were evidence that hands before hers had noticed what the world was losing and had tried, with paper and pressure and ink, to say this was here. That understanding frightened her more than the cash. When the cold finally reached through her coat, she returned to the studio and set the tin box on the work table. The unopened letter remained beneath its red wax. The key lay beside it. The folios waited under their clean paper. The large press stood with its secret spent and its face closed again. Sylvie made no fire that night. She lay beneath the counter with the cedar box under one arm and the field notebook under the other. The room was darker than before, but not emptier. Every hidden thing she had uncovered seemed to have added weight to the silence, and the silence, instead of pressing her down, held its place around her. Near midnight, rain began again, softer than it had been. It touched the north glass above the workroom and moved in patient threads toward the gutters. Sylvie listened until the sound became almost indistinguishable from breathing. The studio had been waiting. Morning entered the studio without warmth, but it entered honestly. The rain had ended before dawn, leaving the north glass beaded with water and the clearing rinsed to a darker green. Sylvie woke beneath the counter with one hand still resting on the cedar box and the other curled around the field notebook. For a few seconds she did not remember the money, the folios, the medal, or the tin box. She knew only the ache in her hip from the floor, the cold at the edge of her blanket, and the small pale rectangle of window above the front shelf. Then memory returned. It did not rush. It assembled itself piece by piece, as careful as a specimen being mounted. She rose slowly and folded the burlap sacks. She washed her face in the basin, though the water was cold enough to make her teeth meet. She combed her hair with her fingers, tied it back with the blue thread from the cedar box, and lit one candle on the work table because the cloud cover had left the room dim. The tin box waited where she had placed it. The sealed paper lay inside beneath the medal and the cloth. Sylvie removed the coins first, then the faded ribbon, then the folded sheet with its red wax wafer. The seal had cracked at one edge, but had not broken. She held the paper near the candle, not close enough for heat, only enough for light to find the surface. The handwriting on the outside was the same angular hand from the labels, but the ink had browned with age. For the one who opens this after me. Sylvie sat down. She had expected the hand to be entirely unfamiliar. Instead, something in the slant of the W, in the careful spacing between words, carried an echo she recognized from Eleanor's field labels. Not the same writing, older, more formal, but a family hand can travel through generations the way a melody travels through closed rooms, altered by each voice and still known. She turned the paper over. On the back, in smaller script, someone had written, "Read before spending, selling, burning, or leaving." That instruction steadied her more than any blessing could have. She took Eleanor's small scissors and slid one blade beneath the brittle wax. Lifting instead of tearing, the seal gave way in two pieces. The fold opened along its old creases, and the paper made a dry sound that seemed louder than weather. Sylvie placed both palms flat on the table and read, "My dear one, whoever you are. If these words have reached your hands, then either I failed to return, or time did what time does and carried my name farther from the mouths of the living. I have made my peace with that. A name is not a house, a body is not a house either. The work may become one if it is kept carefully. My name is Agnes Marrow Whitaker. I'm writing this in Port Townsend, Washington on October 3rd, 1962, after returning from Seattle, where Dr. Nathaniel Kessler of Swedish Hospital told me the shadow in my chest is not a shadow at all, but a growth that has no intention of bargaining. He was kind in the way careful men can be kind when facts have already made the room cold. He said months, perhaps a year. I thanked him because there was nothing useful to say against the truth. Before I write of money, I must write of hands. My great-grandmother Elspeth Marrow came west in 1859 from Stunnington, Maine, after burying 2 infants and deciding that grief had already taken enough land from her. She knew seaweeds, lichens, and the pressing of medicinal plants. Her daughter, Ruth Marrow, born in Port Gamble in 1867, learned to lay ferns so their smallest divisions did not fold under themselves. Ruth's son, Amos Whitaker, born 1891 near Discovery Bay, built this studio in 1912 with a north glass roof because direct sun lies to flowers and cool light tells the truth. I, Agnes, born 1901 in a house that smelled of cedar smoke and alum water, inherited the tables, the presses, and the habit of listening to plants before naming them. Our trade was never grand. We pressed bridal bouquets, funeral lilies, schoolhouse wildflowers, field specimens for teachers, and once a whole basket of orchard blossoms for a woman who could not bear to leave her farm after the bank took it. We gilded frames in thin leaf, not to make the flowers rich, but to remind the living that small things deserve borders. The day the trade ended was November 17th, 1929. A chimney fire in the main house took the east room, the account books, and the drying cabinet where nearly 400 specimens lay between papers. No one died that day, though my father's lungs never forgave the smoke. After that came the Depression, then war, then the slow closing of doors. People still brought flowers now and then, but fewer could pay. Some paid with eggs, mending, apples, a sack of flour. I accepted what came. I remained silent about the older work for more than 30 years, not because I was ashamed, but because the world had grown careless with quiet things. Collectors came asking for rare plants, as if rarity were a decoration. Men from offices wanted locations written plainly so they could dig what should have been left rooted. I kept the folios hidden. The 48 specimens here are not trophies. Some may be gone from their places now, some may be gone entirely. If a wiser age comes, let them serve restoration, not vanity. I lost my husband, Edwin Whitaker, to influenza after the Great War weakened him, though his uniform said he came home. I lost my brother Caleb Marrow in the Argonne in 1918. I lost my son Robert in the Pacific in 1944, near Leyte, and the medal in this box came home when he did not. Do not mistake this for a house of sorrow only. We had beans in summer, snowdrops in February, music from a neighbour's fiddle, and a little girl once laughed so hard at a pressed poppy that milk came out her nose. A life is not one thing. Now I must tell you how to work, because sentiment without instruction is only fog. When pressing fresh flowers, cut after dew has lifted, but before noon heat has loosened the petals, lay them between 3 layers of clean blotter, then newsprint, then ventilator board if you have it. Change the damp papers after the first 12 hours, then daily for 4 days, then every other day until the stem no longer cools your wrist. Most flowers need 2 to 3 weeks under firm pressure. Do not crush. Tighten each wheel 1 turn, then move to the next and come around again. Patient pressure preserves more than force. For mounting, mix methyl cellulose at 2% by weight. Let it hydrate overnight in cool water, never hot. Use a brush almost dry. The adhesive should persuade the stem, not drown it. Japan paper hinges must be torn, not cut, so the fibers feather into the page. For gilded frames, warm the room to 68 degrees Fahrenheit if you can manage it, keep humidity near half, and lay bowl thin beneath the leaf. Breathe away from gold, it moves if you merely wish too loudly. As for inheritance, I do not believe it is the same as ownership. Ownership says, "This is mine." Inheritance asks, "What was kept for me, and what must I keep for someone I will not meet?" The money is for repair, food, taxes, glass, paper, and time. Spend it slowly. The tools are for your hand if your hand proves willing. The specimens are for the future, but not for display to greedy eyes. If you are frightened, good. Fright means you understand the size of receiving. If you are poor, you are not disqualified. Most worthy keeping has been done by those with little to spare. If you are lonely, speak aloud in the room, it has heard worse than loneliness. Behind the studio, beneath the third walnut from the road, you will find an old horseshoe grown into the bark. My father nailed it there in 1913 for luck, though he claimed not to believe in luck. Stand beneath it when you need to remember that a tree can take iron into itself and keep growing. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Agnes Marrow Whitaker, Port Townsend, Washington, October 3, 1962. Sylvie read the letter once without moving. Then she read it again, slower, her finger beneath the lines, not touching the ink but following the path of it through the air. The candle burned down by a quarter-inch. Outside, a crow called from the walnut trees, and the sound entered the room with blunt authority, then left. When she reached the signature the second time, she did not cry in any way that would have satisfied a camera. Her face did not break open. No sound came from her throat. She only placed the page flat on the table, put both hands beside it, and lowered her head until her forehead touched the cold wood between her thumbs. The table smelled faintly of cedar dust and old paste. After a while she lifted her head and folded the letter along its original creases. Not new creases, not easier ones. She let the paper remember its own shape. The red wax pieces she placed in the tin box beside the medal, because even broken seals belong to the thing they once protected. She set the letter on top of the folios, then covered it with clean paper. Only then did she go outside. The back door opened into wet light. The world after rain seemed more exact than before, every blade and twig outlined by water. Sylvie crossed the clearing, past the old pump, and walked toward the walnut row. She counted from the road as Agnes had instructed. First tree, with 2 trunks rising from one root. Second, split high and hollow on the north side. Third, broader than the others, its bark ridged deep enough to hold moss in the seams. At first she saw nothing. Then, on the road-facing side, shoulder height but partly swallowed by the living wood, an iron curve emerged from the trunk. The horseshoe had not been nailed on anymore. The tree had grown around it, holding the old iron in a slow clasp. Only the outer rim remained visible, rusted dark, the nail heads buried under bark. A strand of lichen crossed one side like pale thread. Rainwater rested in the lower curve. Sylvie stood beneath it. A truck passed somewhere beyond the trees, unseen behind the rise, its tires murmuring over wet pavement. The Brannan dog barked once and then stopped, as if the morning had told him this did not concern him. The walnut branches overhead were bare, but at their tips small buds had already formed, tight and brown and waiting through winter before winter had properly begun. She raised one hand and touched the bark below the iron. It was cold, rough, alive. The sentence from the letter returned without needing to be summoned. A tree can take iron into itself and keep growing. Sylvie rested her palm there until her fingers numbed. When she came back inside, the studio felt altered, though nothing had moved. The front room remained dusty, the stove unlit, the windows cracked, the money was still wrapped, the folios still waited, the roof still needed hands, but the room no longer seemed abandoned in the same way. Abandonment was what happened when no one had claim, no one had memory, no one had left instruction. This place had instruction. Near the lower shelf of the work table, beneath rolls of spoiled paper and a stack of warped mats, she had found a short candle the day before, wider than the others and wrapped in yellowed tissue, At the time she had set it aside as a curiosity. Now she unwrapped it carefully. The wax had darkened to cream, the wick was long and slightly bent. Around the base someone had tied a narrow paper label, Bayberry, poured Christmas 1902, for first fire in a restored room. She held the candle in both hands. It was not practical to burn such a thing. A practical person would save it, display it, perhaps sell it to someone who liked antique objects emptied of duty, but the label did not say for saving. It said for first fire in a restored room, and the room was not restored. Not yet. Sylvie placed the candle back in its tissue. Then, after standing still for a long moment, she took one of the plain candles instead and lit it from a match. The flame rose, leaned, steadied. She set it beside the letter, not as ceremony, but as work light. The old bayberry candle would wait for the promise written on it. Some things should not be rushed simply because they had survived. She spent the next hour moving the heirlooms into order. The botanical tools went on a clean cloth. The folios were placed in the driest drawer after she lined it with fresh paper from the usable centre of a damaged sheet. The money returned to its paper bands and then to the oilcloth, except for one $5 bill she left aside with a note in the ledger, removed for necessary food and repair, date marked. The medal remained in the tin, wrapped again in cloth, but not hidden. She placed the tin box in the cedar cabinet where the warped glass panes stood, high enough that mice would not find it. Then she sat on the floor near the stove and wrote down the names. Agnes Marrow Whitaker, Elspeth Marrow, Ruth Marrow, Amos Whitaker, Edwin, Caleb, Robert. Names made the room more crowded, but not in a frightening way. They stood like chairs pulled from a wall before guests arrived. She added the living names too, though she did not know why at first. Marion Voss, who kept the dollar separate. Amos Hadley, who opened a credit ledger without asking for proof she deserved it. The librarian with leaf-shaped silver earrings who printed the route and handed over a pencil. The bus driver with the square grey beard who saved her miles in the rain. Mr. Alvarez from the church basement, who gave her rubber bands for the cedar box. The woman in the red knit hat who gave her a banana and did not require a story in exchange. There were not many, but they made a chain. No single kindness had carried her all the way here. None had been large enough to become a rescue. They were smaller than that, a pencil, a ride shortened, a ledger opened, rubber bands, a piece of fruit, a dollar preserved beneath a glass apple in a county drawer. Yet each had been placed before her at a crossing where, without it, the next step might have become harder than she could take. Sylvie wrote them because small kindnesses vanish if no one records them. They are spent quickly by the receiver and often forgotten by the giver. But they hold weight. They make bridges out of almost nothing. They prove that a person does not have to save an entire life to keep 1 hour from collapsing. And maybe if you're listening to this now from a kitchen after work, or a chair beside a sleeping house, or a hospital room with the TV turned low, you know the kind of kindness I mean. Not the grand gesture people tell at parties, the other kind, the quiet one. A neighbour who shovelled your steps when you were too tired to ask. A nurse who warmed the blanket before bringing it. A cashier who pretended not to notice when you were short by a few coins. A teacher who kept your child after class and gave them a sandwich without making charity out of it. If someone once placed a small mercy in your path, say their name if you can, write it down, tell us about it when you're ready. Some names deserve to be kept in a room with the light still on. By late afternoon, Sylvie's body began to ask for sleep with the bluntness of debt. She had not done the roof. She had not walked back to town. She had not tested the well or repaired the back sill. The letter had made a kind of work inside her, and that work had taken strength. She lit the stove carefully, using the method that had held before. While the kindling caught, she warmed a small pan of water and softened the last of her hard bread in it, adding the potato skins she had saved and a little salt. The meal was thin, but warm enough to steam. She ate slowly beside the stove, the letter folded in clean paper near her knee. When darkness came, she made her bed not beneath the counter but in the workroom, on the floor beside the standing press. The front room felt farther from what had been given into her keeping. She laid burlap in 2 layers, put her coat over her legs, and arranged the cedar box, the tin, the ledger, and the wrapped tools within reach of her hand. Before lying down, she looked once toward the drawer where the folios rested. 48 lost or vanishing plants lay there in the dark, waiting for a future careful enough to ask the right questions. Money lay wrapped not far away, less like rescue now than assignment. The medal held its year in its silence. The letter had returned names to the room. Sylvie blew out the candle. The stove breathed softly through its cleaned throat. Above her, rainwater left from the storm slid down the north glass in slow trails, catching the last ember light and losing it. The press stood beside her, emptied of its secret, but not of its meaning. She slept with the heirlooms close enough to touch. The first snow came on December 4th, just before dawn, and by the time Sylvie opened the back door, 3 inches had gathered on the clearing. It did not fall like the snow in picture books. It came wet and slanted, catching in the grass between the tire tracks and weighing down the blackberry canes until their thorns touched the ground. The walnut limbs wore white along their upper sides. The studio roof, with its patched glass and tired cedar shingles, held the snow unevenly, as if the building were trying to remember how to carry winter. Sylvie stood at the threshold with her coat wrapped tight and watched the north glass turn pale under the weight. A roof did not forgive delay. She had known that in the plain way all poor people know urgent things before they can afford to act on them. Leaks were never only leaks. They entered wood, insulation, paper, sleep, and the future. Water was patient. It did not need permission. Inside, she opened the repair book to the roofing chapter and read it 3 times before making tea from warmed water and dried mint she had found in a jar still sealed with wax. The chapter was written for sheds, barns, pump houses, and lean-to kitchens, not for a pressed flower studio with a north glass pitch and cedar shingles laid by hands long gone, but it taught principles, and principles could be adapted by a careful person. Find the line of failure. Do not trap moisture. Repair structure before surface. Overlap always belongs to gravity. She copied those 4 sentences into the ledger, then measured the roof from below with twine, from outside with the borrowed ladder, and again from the clearing by counting shingle courses. The front cedar section measured 16 feet wide and a little over 12 feet from ridge to eave. The glass pitch over the workroom did not need shingles, only temporary flashing where the wooden curb had opened near the upper seam. The worst damage lay at the back corner where water had travelled beneath shingles, softened decking, and found the rear sill. Amos Hadley listened to her measurements without interrupting. At the hardware counter, he pulled a pencil from behind one ear and wrote figures on brown paper. You do not need a whole roof. You need the bad 12 square feet opened, dried if it will dry, sistered if it will not, then covered. Half bundle cedar shingles, 8 feet felt, galvanized nails, 1 3/4 inch, flashing scrap for the glass curb, roofing cement only where metal meets old wood, and not as confession. Sylvie stood with her hands in her coat pockets to keep them warm. How many shingles? About 40 if you waste none, 50 if you behave like a human. He priced them slowly. Half bundle of cedar shingles, $11.25 on account. Roofing felt cut from a torn roll, $2.10. 1 pound 1 3/4 inch galvanized roofing nails, $142. Chalk line borrowed. Utility knife used, 60 cents. 2 8-foot strips of scrap flashing, $2. 1 small pry bar borrowed, return clean. Then he went into the back room and came out holding a roofing hatchet with a leather handle dark from use. The head had a gauge notch and a nail slot, and the blade had been sharpened down through years until it looked almost modest. This was my brother Lyle's, Amos said. He roofed half of Chimacum before his knees gave out. He is dead now, and the hatchet has been making me feel accused from a drawer. I can't take that. You are not taking it, you are putting it back to work. He laid it on the counter between them. Sylvie touched the handle with 2 fingers. The leather was smooth where a thumb had lived. I don't know how to use it. No, Amos said. That is why you are not going up there alone. The elder roofer arrived the next morning in a tan pickup that sounded older than its paint. His name was Neil Pritchard. He was 74, built narrow as a fence rail with shoulders still square under a wool jacket, and hands that had become almost architectural with tendon and bone. He wore a black watch cap pulled low and carried a thermos with a dent near the lid. When Amos introduced him, Neil looked at the studio, the snow on the roof, the sag at the back corner, and Sylvie's gloves in that order. "No pay," he said. Sylvie had not offered any. "I have coffee," she said. He glanced at the stovepipe. "Bad coffee?" "Probably." "That is roofing coffee." Those were the most words he said for an hour. For 11 days, weather allowed work in fragments. They began by clearing snow with a push broom tied to a pole. Neil taught her to stand on the ladder before trusting the roof, to listen through her boots, to keep 3 points of contact, and to never put a knee where a foot had not first asked permission. He moved slowly, but not weakly. Every motion had been reduced to what was necessary. They stripped the damaged shingles at the rear corner first. The old nails came out reddish and stubborn. Some broke, some brought threads of cedar with them. Beneath the felt had rotted to black paper lace. The decking near the eave was soft enough for Neil's awl to enter without pressure. "That board's done," he said. They removed it in pieces. The smell beneath was cold rot, dark and fungal, but not yet spread beyond the corner. One rafter tail had softened at the top. Neil showed her how to sister it with new wood, rather than replace what still held. "Old rafter carries history," he said. "New one carries load." He made her repeat the cut line twice before touching the saw. The sister rafter was measured, trimmed, checked, removed, trimmed again, and then fastened tight against the old with 8D nails angled in opposing pairs. He watched her first nail stand slightly above the surface. "That nail's proud." She reached for the hammer. "Pull it." She pulled it. He handed her another nail. Again. By the 4th day, she understood that Neil's teaching style was not impatience. It was trust given in hard pieces. He did not soften the work because she was young, cold, hungry, or alone. He made the roof exact because mercy in a roof is measured by whether it holds through rain. The chalk line came next. He let her snap it too soon once, while the felt still buckled. Wrinkles hold water. She lifted the felt, smoothed it, and snapped again. The blue line appeared on black paper, clean and startling. Neil nodded one time. Shingles were laid from the lower edge upward, each one offset, each exposure measured against the hatchet gauge. Neil taught the 3-stroke nail. Set, drive, seat. Not 4 uncertain taps. Not one proud blow that split cedar. Set, drive, seat. The sound changed when she did it correctly, becoming less metallic and more final. On the 7th day, rain came at noon and drove them inside. Neil drank her bad coffee from a chipped mug and said nothing about the framed flowers on the wall. He only looked at them for a long time while steam rose between his hands. "My mother had her wedding violets done here," he said finally. Sylvie looked up. Frame broke in the quake. Flowers held. That was all he offered. It was enough. They repaired the flashing where the glass curb met the roof, lifting brittle old metal, cleaning beneath it, sliding the new scrap under the upper edge, and bedding only the joint in a thin line of roofing cement. Sylvie remembered Amos' warning against fear, used like frosting. She spread the black cement with a scrap of shingle thin and deliberate. By the 11th day, the patched roof no longer looked new. That pleased Neil. New would have announced itself badly. The cedar shingles lay pale among the older grey ones, but rain would darken them, then time. The repaired corner sat straight, the temporary flashing held. Inside, the pan beneath the worst leak remained dry through one long afternoon of rain. Neil stood in the clearing with his thermos under one arm and studied their work. "It'll winter," he said. Sylvie heard the sentence as a blessing because he did not know how to give one any other way. Before leaving, he returned the roofing hatchet to her hand. "Keep the edge oiled. It is Lyle's." Lyle hated drawers. The truck carried him out along the gravel spur in low gear. Sylvie stood under the walnut trees until the sound disappeared toward the road. Snowmelt dropped from the repaired eave in steady beads, but none entered the workroom. For the first time since arriving, she looked up during rain and did not count the falling inside. By mid-December, the roof was not finished in any grand sense. It was only defended. That was enough for winter to meet. January entered through brick. The roof patch held through Christmas rain, then through a hard freeze that silvered every nail head on the front steps. The stove became the centre of Sylvie's days, but the chimney began to show its deeper illness once she used it regularly. Fine powder gathered on the hearth. A pale line opened in the mortar near the lower flue. Outside, several bricks at the shoulder had begun to spoil, their faces flaking away in thin red scales after nights in the 20s. Amos came out on New Year's Day after closing the store early. He did not remove his hat inside, only stood near the stove with one hand above the pipe, feeling draught. Then he went outside and circled the chimney twice. Water got in, he said, froze, opened the brick. Can it be repaired? Everything can be repaired until it can't. This one can. He said she needed to rake out bad mortar, leave sound mortar alone, and use a mix soft enough to move with old brick. Portland cement would be too hard. It would trap water and break the faces faster. Hydraulic lime would be kinder, fire clay near the hotter joints, sand sharp enough to grip. On a scrap of cardboard, he wrote the mix. For exterior repointing, 2 parts sharp sand, 1 part natural hydraulic lime, add water slowly, peanut butter, not soup. For firebox adjacent joints, 2 parts sand, 1 part fire clay, 1 part hydraulic lime, small batches, use before it stiffens. Do not smear over the face, Amos said. Mortar belongs between bricks, not on them. He lent her a joint raker, a pointing trowel narrow as a butter knife, and a brick brush nearly bald from years of use. The lime and fire clay went onto the account. He added 2 pairs of heavier gloves and a small tub for mixing. Hands numb fast in lime, he warned. Do not be brave with skin. The work took 3 weeks because winter allowed only pieces of days. Sylvie began each morning by warming water on the stove, not for comfort but so her fingers could move before touching metal tools. Outside, the air held near 27 degrees by aft most mornings and sometimes climbed to 34 degrees by afternoon. Breath smoked in front of her. The mortar joints looked harmless until she raked them. Then bad sections fell out as powder, leaving dark grooves between brick. She learned to distinguish sound by resistance. Good mortar argued. Bad mortar surrendered. On the first day she removed too much from one joint, and Amos, arriving with a sack of sand, made her look at the hollow. Old work is not an enemy, he said. Do not punish what is still doing its job. After that, she moved slower. Every 15 minutes her fingers went numb, even inside gloves. She climbed down, tucked her hands beneath her arms and waited until pain returned. Pain meant blood had come back. Then she climbed again. She brushed joints clean, misted them lightly so the dry brick would not steal water too quickly, and pressed mortar deep with the narrow trowel. The first batches failed, too wet, and they sagged, too dry, and they crumbled before seating. The correct mix had weight and patience. It held the trowel's edge, accepted pressure, and gave back a slight sheen when tooled. She worked from the bottom upward, leaving the spoiled faces for last. 3 bricks near the shoulder had lost enough surface to need replacement, but Amos advised waiting until spring unless they loosened. Winter repair is triage, he said. Do not perform surgery in sleet. So she stabilized. She repointed the open joints, patched the worst voids, and covered the shoulder with a temporary tin cap during freezing rain. She learned to tool a concave joint with a piece of copper pipe cut short. She learned that lime on skin did not hurt at first, which made it more dangerous. She learned to wash thoroughly before eating, though her meals were small and usually taken standing beside the stove while mortar tightened outside. The studio became a place of 2 temperatures. Near the stove, warmth held in a circle just wide enough for a body, a basin, and a book. Near the door, frost feathered the lower corners of the glass. In the workroom, the folios stayed wrapped and elevated, protected from damp by all the vigilance Sylvie could offer. She checked them every morning before the chimney, every night before sleep. During the 2nd week, snow returned without depth, only a dusting that made the chimney bricks show every flaw. Sylvie worked with a scarf over her nose and her hat pulled low. Neil Pritchard stopped by once, watched from the ground, and said, "Joints fat." She scraped it back. "Better." Then he left. The final test came late in January, on a clear evening when the air sharpened after sunset and stars appeared above the walnut trees. Sylvie had let the new mortar cure as long as cold weather allowed. She built a small fire first, no larger than 2 handfuls of kindling. Smoke drew clean. She added 1 split piece of wood and waited. The stove clicked, the pipe warmed, and outside the chimney released a thin grey line that rose instead of spreading under the eave. Amos stood in the clearing with his hands in his apron pockets, looking upward. "Again," he said. She added another piece. The smoke went clean. No backdraft entered the room. No bitter creosote smell deepened beyond the ordinary scent of fire. No powder fell onto the hearth. The chimney took what it was given and carried it away. Sylvie stood beside the stove with lime still caught beneath one fingernail, and felt heat gather in the brick behind it. Not much, enough. Amos nodded toward the chimney. That'll do till spring. She had come to understand that, from him, this meant nearly everything. After he left, she opened the front door and watched the last smoke lift into the January dark. The repaired joints were not pretty. Some were smoother than others. One patch near the base bore the slight tremor of her tired hand. But the chimney stood closer to whole than it had before, and the fire inside the studio no longer felt borrowed from danger. That night she warmed beans in the enamel pot, and ate them with bread from Doris at the Blue Heron, wrapped in paper and left without charge, because Amos had apparently told half the town only what they needed to know and no more. Sylvie slept near the stove, not because she had nowhere else to sleep, but because the room had begun to keep heat until morning. The floors revealed themselves after the chimney work ended. For weeks, Sylvie had known them as obstacles: safe boards, rotten boards, boards to cross near the joist, boards to avoid after rain. But once the stove breathed properly, and the worst roof leak had stopped, the pine began to dry. Dust lifted more easily. The grey surface nearest the door gave way under scrubbing to something warmer below. In the protected places beneath old cabinets and frame racks, the boards still held a deep colour, dark honey moving toward mahogany where age and oil had once entered. She did not plan to refinish them in January. The decision came because one morning she found herself sweeping the same boards for the 4th time and realized she was no longer cleaning dirt. She was asking the room to show her what remained. The boards were white pine, wide and uneven, some nearly 14 inches across. Their edges bore slight gaps from seasonal movement. Hand-cut rose head nails held them at irregular intervals, each nail head dark and square, not the bright circles of modern work. A few had lifted. Several near the door had been driven down hard long ago and left bruises in the wood. Amos rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day, then refused to hand it over until she proved she had listened. Never stop moving while it's on. Yes, sir. Do not chase stains through the floor. Yes, sir. Respect nail heads. Yes, sir. And dust is not weather. Wear the mask. Yes, sir. He sold her 3 sanding discs, each of 80, 120 to 20 grit, plus 1 extra 80 because optimism ruins sandpaper. He also gave her a nail set from a jar of mismatched tools and made her pay 10 cents for it so she would not forget to bring it back. Before sanding, she spent 2 days preparing the boards. She swept, scrubbed lightly, let them dry, then crawled across the front room, setting proud nails below the surface one by one. The rose head nails resisted. Some rang under the hammer with a bright note. Others sank with a duller sound that warned of softness beneath. She marked 2 questionable boards for later repair, and did not sand them deeply. The first pass, 80 grit, was the loudest work she had done inside the studio. The sander growled in her hands, pulling slightly, eager to make a careless circle if she let her attention loosen. Dust rose in pale clouds despite the collection bag. It entered her sleeves, gathered at her eyelashes, and settled on the hanging frames she had covered with sheets. She worked in long lanes with the grain never bearing down. The machine removed greyness, old finish, watermarks softened by time, and the thin surface layer that had held decades of unoccupied air. Underneath, the pine emerged slowly. Not new, better than new. The scars remained: a burn mark near the stove, a crescent gouge beside the workroom door, dark pinholes where beetles had once explored and abandoned the boards, long dents where frame racks or table legs had stood for years. The sander clarified them without erasing them. The second pass, 120 grit, quieted the surface. The boards no longer caught the cloth when she wiped them. The room began to reflect light upward in a low way, not shine but response. By then her wrists ached and her shoulders had grown tight enough that turning her head hurt. She returned the sander after the second day and begged one more rental before admitting she did not have the strength to finish. Amos looked at her across the counter. Strength is not the question. Schedule is. Floors are patient. She rented it for a third day after resting one. The final pass, 220 grit, felt almost tender. The machine hummed rather than fought. She moved slower, not because the grit demanded it, but because she could see what the boards were becoming. When she vacuumed with the borrowed shop vac and wiped with barely damp cloth, the grain appeared in long amber lines, each board carrying its own weather. For finish, Amos recommended 3 coats of oil, tongue oil cut lightly for penetration on the first coat, then a linseed blend for warmth, then a final thin tongue coat after a full cure. He made her write the schedule. First coat, thin wipe excess after 30 minutes. Second coat after 48 hours. Do not rush. Third coat after another 48 hours if surface accepts. No puddles. No closed windows during drying. No sleeping in the room with heavy fumes. She worked with the front door cracked and the stove low. The first coat entered the wood as if the boards had been thirsty for years. The colour changed while she watched. Grey honey to dark honey to something richer at the knots, almost mahogany in the old protected places. She wiped every board on her knees, following the grain, changing rags before they grew sticky. The studio began to smell of oil, pine, smoke, and cold air. By the second coat, the front room had become nearly unrecognisable beneath its same walls, not restored, not finished, but awakened at the floor. Light from the cracked windows reached down and found itself answered. The hanging pressed flowers no longer seemed to float above neglect. They belonged again to a room with a surface. The studio had been waiting. The sentence came to her while she was buffing the threshold between the front room and the workroom with a rag wrapped around her hand. She did not say it aloud, it did not need her voice. Then came the bad morning. It was late January, 3 days after the final coat, when she woke with a heaviness so complete that she could not lift the kettle. Not illness exactly, not grief in its dramatic clothes, only depletion plain and thorough. Her hands hurt, her knees had bruises in half-moons. The split at her knuckle had reopened. Every task waiting for her seemed attached to 10 more she had not yet named. She put on her coat and walked away from the studio without eating. The marsh lay beyond the orchard parcel, down a path made by deer and perhaps by children long grown. Frost held in the grass where sun had not reached. The creek moved under a skin of thin ice near the edges, loud in the centre where snowmelt found its way through stones. Cattails stood broken and bronze. Reed heads nodded under their own weight. Sylvie sat on a fallen log and did no work. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, one leg lifted, neck drawn into itself with monkish patience. It did not hunt for several minutes, it only waited, a blue-grey question against the pale marsh. Then, with a motion so exact it seemed prepared long before hunger required it, the bird struck the water and lifted a small silver fish. Sylvie watched until the heron flew. Its wings opened wider than she expected. The bird rose slowly, carrying its long legs behind, and crossed the marsh without needing to prove anything to the ground it left. She stayed there until cold entered through the log and into her bones. She did not count supplies, she did not plan the windows, she did not feel better in any clean way. But when she returned to the studio near dusk, the floors were still there, holding their oil, holding their scars, holding the light that remained. Some days restoration meant not making the ruin worse by forcing tired hands to continue. She slept early and worked the next morning. February made the windows urgent. The roof no longer leaked freely. The chimney drew, and the floors had begun to hold warmth, but wind still entered through broken glass and loose sashes with the persistence of an unpaid bill. At night the candle flames leaned sideways. Frost formed on the inside of panes that still existed. The workroom, with its north glass and specimen drawers, needed steadier air than patched cloth could provide. There were 8 windows low enough to repair by hand. 3 had no full glass at all, only jagged edges left in old putty and temporary boards nailed across from the outside. 4 had cracked panes, each crack moving like a frozen river from corner to corner. 1 in the front room near the counter was original, or close enough that Amos told her not to touch it unless it fell into her hands and begged. Wavy glass, he said, tapping the pane lightly. Could be 1912. Could be earlier reused. You do not replace that because it offends your eye. It has a crack near the lower edge. Then it has a crack near the lower edge. It leaks air. So do all of us. The original pane stayed. Amos ordered replacement glass cut to measure for the missing and worst cracked panes, charging only for what he had to pay the glass man and putting the rest onto the ledger with a line so faint Sylvie knew he intended to forget part of it later. He sold her DAP 33 glazing putty, glazing points, a putty knife with 1 chipped corner, a roll of 1/4 inch cotton sash cord, and a small block of beeswax for easing old channels. He explained sash windows on the counter with 2 scraps of wood and a spool of twine. The weights are in the pockets. Do not drop them. Do not curse if you do. Everyone drops one eventually. I will try not to. Trying is not the same as tying. He showed her the knot, a figure 8 tied fat enough not to slip through the weight eye, dressed tight, tail trimmed but not too close. Then he made her tie it 6 times while the grey cat watched from the seed rack. The first window took an entire day. She removed the interior stop carefully, numbering each piece in pencil. The old paint held like pride, so she scored seams with the utility knife before prying. The lower sash came free with a sigh of dust and cold air. In the pocket, the sash weight hung from a cord so rotten it broke when she touched it, dropping the iron weight 6 inches into the cavity with a thud that stopped her breath. She did not curse. She sat on the floor and closed her eyes. Then she retrieved it with a bent coat hanger and an hour of patient humiliation. The glass removal was slower. She softened old putty with cautious heat from a cloth-wrapped warming brick. Never flame. Some putty came out in satisfying strips. Some resisted as if it had grown from the wood. The glazing points hid beneath hardened ridges. She found them by touch, lifted them with the chisel, and kept every shard of broken glass in a coffee can marked with charcoal. The new pane seated into the rabbit with a small, clear sound. Glazing points held it lightly, not tightly. Putty came next. DAP 33 was stiffer than she expected in cold weather, so she warmed the can near the stove, kneaded a rope between her palms, and pressed it along the edge. The first bevel looked clumsy, too thick in one corner, too thin in another. She scraped it out and began again. By evening the putty line stood at a steady angle, shedding imaginary rain even before it cured. The second window took half a day. The third took 3 hours. The fourth humbled her by revealing a swollen sash rail that would not return to square. Neil Pritchard appeared at the door just as she was considering violence against the laws of carpentry. "Plane," he said. "I do not have one." He handed her a block plane from his coat pocket. Thin shavings. She took too thick a shaving first. He looked at the curl on the floor. "Firewood." She adjusted the blade. The plane whispered properly after that. Replacing sash cord became a ritual of its own. Open pocket, lift weight, untie or cut old cord, thread new cord over pulley, cotton rubbing against metal with a dry murmur, tie figure 8 knot at counterweight, pull sash to height, nail cord into the groove, test, adjust, test again. When a sash moved correctly, it did not announce triumph. It simply rose and stayed where she asked it to stay. That modest obedience nearly made her laugh the first time. Wind changed in the studio after the fifth repair. It no longer entered as a trespasser, but as weather kept at a respectful distance. The candle flame stood straighter, the stove used less wood, the workroom paper stopped lifting at the corners whenever a gust crossed the clearing. She saved the original pane for last, not to replace, but to protect. The crack near the lower edge was stable, Amos said, so she cleaned the frame, renewed only the missing putty along one side, and left the old glass in place. When she wiped it with vinegar water and newspaper, the view through it bent slightly, turning the walnut branches outside into lines that wavered as if seen through memory. On the final window she worked in rare February sunlight. The air was still cold, but the light had strength in it. She had opened the sash pocket, replaced the cord, tied the figure-8 knot cleanly on the first try, and set the weight back without dropping it. The new pane waited on folded cloth. Putty warmed near the stove. As she pressed the last bevel into place, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside. It was close enough for her to see the black cap, the white cheek, the quick bead of its eye. The bird tilted its head, inspected the repaired window, then pecked once at the branch where a bud had begun to swell. Sylvie held the putty knife still. The chickadee stayed only a few seconds. Then it lifted, crossed the clearing, and vanished into the firs. Sylvie finished the line of putty, smoothing the corner with one careful stroke. The window held, the room held, the cold remained outside where it belonged. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Sylvie finished the first piece she was willing to let leave her hands. It was not large, a pressed winter camellia, pale pink at the outer petals and nearly cream toward the centre, mounted on warm Japan paper with torn hinges so fine they disappeared unless light crossed them sideways. Around it, she had placed 3 narrow stems of sweet woodruff and 1 brown fern frond gathered from the north edge of the orchard path. The label was written in pencil first, then ink when she was certain. Camellia japonica, Port Townsend, cut after rain, December 8, 2024. She mixed the methyl cellulose the night before, 2% by weight, letting it hydrate slowly in a covered jar near the coolest wall. She did not hurry the brush. Agnes had warned against drowning a stem, and Eleanor had taught the same lesson with fewer words. The adhesive touched only where it had to. Each hinge persuaded the plant to rest, not submit. The frame was narrow walnut, repaired from old stock found in the studio and rubbed with oil until the grain deepened. She laid the gilding only along the inner lip, a line so thin it seemed less like decoration than breath held in light. The glass was UV block, ordered after 6 months of saving from small commissions and 1 careful sale of duplicate supplies she did not need. When the backing board was sealed and the hanging wire tightened, Sylvie set the finished frame on the front counter. She did not call anyone. The studio was quiet enough to receive the moment without witness. The interior had changed, but not beyond recognition. That mattered to her. The front room still held the old counter, though its surface had been sanded by hand and waxed until it felt soft beneath the palm. The white shelves had been cleaned, mended, and painted only where rot demanded it, leaving age visible along the edges. The iron stove stood black and steady on a cleaned hearth, with a row of split wood stacked beside it in a cedar box Caleb had built from scrap. The floors had darkened into a deep honey brown after 2 years of use and oil. They still carried scars. Sylvie had refused to sand them again. A burn near the stove remained. The crescent gouge near the workroom door remained. The marks had become a kind of record, and records were not flaws simply because they survived. In the workroom, the north glass no longer leaked. Light came through it cleanly in winter, cool and even, touching the long tables, the specimen racks, the drawers, and the standing press. The press remained at the far end of the room, no longer a sealed mystery, but not emptied of its authority. Its carved aster had been cleaned with a soft brush and nothing more. The hidden keyhole was closed. The brass key that had opened it rested in a small dish beside the ledger. Another brass key rested on the mantel. That one had waited nearly 2 years before revealing its purpose. Sylvie had found it in a small oak box beneath the 3rd cellar step during the 1st February, along with a tin-type photograph from 1903. In the photograph, a young woman stood before the same studio when its cedar boards were still pale and the sign above the door was new. Her face had startled Sylvie so deeply that she had sat on the granite step until the candle burned low. The woman was not identical to her, but the resemblance was close enough to feel like a hand reaching through generations. On the back, in brown ink, was written, "Clara Marrow, daughter of Agnes Whitaker, age 25, summer of 1903. The key's bow was shaped like an aster. For a long time, Sylvie did not know what it opened. She tried no locks recklessly. The studio had taught her that hidden things reveal themselves when use and attention have made the right question. So the key stayed on the mantel, above the stove, beside the folded copy of Agnes's letter. It was the walnut tree that answered. In late October of the second year, after a storm shook the orchard hard enough to scatter green husks across the grass, Sylvie went out to clear branches from the path. The third walnut from the road had shed a limb the width of her wrist. When she lifted it, she saw a dull brass plate set low in the trunk, half hidden by bark that had grown around its edges. The horseshoe was above it, still held in the tree's living grip. The plate had been darkened by time until it looked like shadow. There was a keyhole at the centre. Sylvie stood in the wet leaves for a long while before going inside. The brass key turned with difficulty. Bark had pressed against the plate, and the little door had swollen in its wooden pocket. But it opened after patient work with oil, a knife blade, and both hands. Inside the hollow was a tin cylinder wrapped in oilcloth. The tree had grown around the compartment, sealing it from weather without crushing it. Inside the cylinder lay a folded 48-star flag, small enough to have been carried, worn at the creases but intact. Beneath it was a note. The handwriting was Agnes's, but younger than the letter in the press. Robert carried this flag in his kit until May 1944. If it comes home without him, keep it out of drawers and away from speeches. Let it rest where wind can reach it once a year. There was no ornament in the sentence, no grand claim, just instruction. Sylvie took the flag inside, unfolded it on the work table, and stood beside it until the room darkened. The 48 stars looked plain and solemn. She did not iron it. She did not frame it. She did not make it into an object for admiration. On the next Memorial Day, she carried it with the World War II Victory Medal to Fort Worden Military Cemetery, where wind crossed the grass from the water and the stones stood in quiet rows. It was May 27th, 2024. She had checked the date 3 times, wanting the observance right. She found no grave for Robert Whitaker there. His body had not returned from the Pacific. So she stood near the flagpole, with the medal wrapped in cloth and the small flag folded against her chest, and let the wind touch both. A groundskeeper passed at a distance and did not interrupt. Gulls turned over the bluff. The water below was a hard blue under the late spring light. Sylvie spoke his name once, then Caleb Marrow's, then Edwin's, not loudly. Loudness was not the same as honour. When she returned to the studio, she placed the medal in a shallow walnut case Caleb had carved and set it inside the cedar cabinet, not hidden, not displayed in the window. The flag went back into its oilcloth, then into an archival box she had ordered after saving for 3 months. Once each year she took it out when the weather allowed wind. The money had lasted because she treated it as Agnes had instructed. Only a few coins had been spent in a literal sense, and even those were chosen with care. 1 wheat penny went into the first order for Japan paper, tucked beneath the invoice as a private witness. 1 mercury dime was spent at Hadley Hardware on the day. Sylvie paid the final balance in the black ledger, though Amos tried to refuse it and only accepted when she told him it was not payment but punctuation. A worn buffalo nickel bought a pencil from the library donation jar, the same kind of yellow pencil once handed across the reference desk. The rest of the coins remained wrapped in cloth. Most of the cash had gone where Agnes had meant it to go. Taxes, roof work, chimney work, glass, lime, paper, food, and time. Sylvie accounted for every dollar in the ledger. When there was enough left to tempt fear into spending too quickly, she wrapped the remainder again, sealed it in oilcloth, and placed it inside the press compartment with a new note of her own. For the next one if there is need. She did not know who the next one might be. That was the nature of inheritance. A person keeps faith without knowing the face that will receive it. The shop reopened without announcement. There was no sign painted fresh across the road, no article in the paper, no ceremony with scissors and ribbon. Doris at the Blue Heron pinned one index card to the cafe corkboard between a lost cat notice and a flyer for fiddle lessons. Aster and fern botanical pressing. Memorial flowers, field specimens, careful framing. By appointment. Leave name with Doris. The first call came from a widow who wanted her husband's funeral spray preserved but apologized 3 times because the lilies had already browned at the edges. Sylvie told her to bring them anyway. Some flowers were meant to be remembered after their first beauty had passed. The second came from a schoolteacher with a class project on native plants. The third came from a woman who had kept her mother's garden roses in a plastic bag in the freezer for 7 months because she did not know what else to do with them. By the end of the second winter, the mailing list had 43 names. Sylvie wrote each one by hand in the ledger before entering it anywhere else. Names deserved ink before they became data. Most commissions were modest: a pressed fern for a birthday, a wedding boutonniere mounted with 1 line of handwriting beneath it, a field specimen for a retired park ranger whose hands shook too much to mount it himself. She charged enough to keep the lights on after electricity was properly restored, but not enough to make the work cruel. People came quietly. They lowered their voices in the front room without being asked. They looked at the hanging flowers behind glass and understood, some sooner than others, that the studio did not sell decoration first, it kept evidence of tenderness. Caleb returned in March with the sign. He was taller by then, though still narrow, and he arrived on his Schwinn bicycle with a package tied across the handlebars in an old quilt. He had split wood for her during the first winter and refused money with the stubbornness of a boy obeying a mother who had raised him well. Since then he had come and gone when work was needed, sometimes repairing a latch, sometimes hauling kindling, sometimes sitting on the step to drink cider without explaining why he did not want to go home yet. The package was awkward enough that he nearly dropped the bicycle turning into the clearing. "I made something," he said. Sylvie came down the steps, wiping methyl cellulose from her fingers with a damp cloth. "For the studio?" He nodded. The board was cedar, hand-carved, sanded and oiled. The letters were not machine perfect. They were better than that. They held the marks of a knife guided slowly. Aster and fern. Whitaker and daughters. Botanical pressing and gilded framing. Sylvie read it once. Then again. The plural stood there, plain as daylight. "Daughters," she said. Caleb looked toward the walnut trees as if consulting them. "My mother said it should be plural. Your mother never met my daughters. You don't have any?" "No." He shifted his weight. "She said that isn't the point." Sylvie kept her hand on the edge of the sign. The cedar was smooth beneath her thumb, but one place near the ampersand held a slight ridge where the knife had changed direction. Caleb cleared his throat. "She said a place like this is not supposed to end with one person." The clearing grew very still around that sentence. The old sign above the door had been repaired but left faded. Sylvie had never replaced it because replacing felt too much like erasing. Now she understood that the new sign did not need to cover the old one. Neil helped them hang it below, slightly lower, where both could be seen. Aster and fern as it had been, Whitaker and daughters as it might become. When the last screw was set, Caleb stepped back and pretended to inspect the angle with professional severity. "That screw's proud," Sylvie said. He looked at her, startled, then he laughed. It was the first easy laugh the clearing had held in a long time. That evening, after Caleb rode home and the light thinned over the orchard, Sylvie sat at the work table with Agnes's letter open beside a clean sheet of paper. The stove warmed the room. A tray of pressed snowdrops rested under light weight in the smaller press. The finished camellia frame waited on the counter to be wrapped for its owner in the morning. Sylvie dipped her pen. She had written labels, receipts, ledger entries, instructions, and apology notes for delays caused by rain. But this was different. This was not for a customer, not for the county, not for the mailing list. This was for a person she would not meet. She wrote the first line because it had already been given to her. "My dear one, whoever you are," then she stopped. The words opened a room larger than the page. She did not know yet what diagnosis, fire, war, debt, or mercy might shape the life of the person who would one day read her letter. She did not know whether that person would be young or aged, frightened or merely tired, related by blood or only by need. She knew only that someone had once written across time with enough trust to leave instructions instead of demands. So Sylvie wrote what she could. She wrote that roofs must be checked after the first hard rain, even if they were repaired well. She wrote that the north glass should be washed with vinegar, not scraped dry. She wrote that methyl cellulose should be mixed the night before, and that gold leaf moves when breathed upon. She wrote that the third walnut holds iron, a flag, and more patience than most people can imagine. She wrote that the cash, if any remained, was not escape money unless escape was necessary. It was keeping money, repair money, bread money, time money. She wrote Eleanor's name. She wrote Agnes's. She wrote Marion Voss, Amos Hadley, Neil Pritchard, Doris, Caleb, Reverend Boyd, the librarian with leaf-shaped earrings, the bus driver, Mr. Alvarez, and the woman in the red knit hat. She did not know all their full names. She wrote what she had. "Small kindnesses," she wrote, "are not small after they have carried a person across a hard season." The stove settled. A log broke inward. Sparks lifted behind the mica window and vanished. Sylvie folded the unfinished letter and placed it in the ledger. She would add to it over years. A letter meant for the future did not need to be completed in one sitting. It needed to be true. Outside, the walnut branches moved in a winter wind. The horseshoe held. The new sign creaked once on its hooks. The studio, repaired but not perfected, stood in the clearing with light in its windows and pressed flowers drying under careful weight. The pressed flower studio waits. It has always waited. Far down in the county clerk's office, in a drawer beneath a glass apple paperweight, one worn dollar bill still lay apart from the others. Marion Voss had retired by then, but before leaving she had taped a small note under the drawer lip where only the next careful clerk would see it. "First dollar paid for aster and fern. Do not spend." And so the dollar remained there, folded flat, not valuable in the way banks measure value, but kept in the way people keep proof that something nearly lost had once been chosen. A quiet bill, a quiet room. A quiet life beginning again.